Welcome, dear listeners. There's something unsettling about the way people used to sleep. Not what they dreamed, but how they dared to do it. Imagine a world where the night itself felt dangerous, where lying down seemed far too much like giving up, and where the safest way to rest was to stay half awake, half alive, sitting upright in bed like a weary guard waiting for morning. This was the 1600s, a time when fear passed for wisdom and medicine was mostly superstition wearing a serious face. Candles flickered, shutters moaned in the wind, and the darkness outside wasn't empty. It was occupied. People didn't trust the night, or their bodies, or even their beds. They believed that if you slept too flat, your soul might slip away before dawn, or worse, something unseen might take its place. So they sat up to sleep, pillows stacked high, blankets drawn tight, eyes fluttering half shut, as though negotiating with the dark. Each night was a small act of survival, a quiet standoff between the living and the waiting. And if you opened your eyes to see the sunrise, you had, for one more day, won the argument. Before we begin, be sure to like, share and subscribe. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket and let's travel together. Way, way back together. They say comfort is a modern invention. But if you were alive in the 1600s, comfort meant not dying in your sleep, which frankly was a reasonable concern. Picture it. A bedroom lit by the dim tremble of a single tallow candle, its smoke thick enough to flavour your dreams. The bed, a wooden contraption that creaked like a guilty conscience, draped in curtains to keep out draughts, and sometimes rats. And there, propped against a tower of lumpy pillows, is you, sitting up to sleep. Not because you enjoy pretending to be a corpse halfway risen, but because lying flat was considered practically an invitation for death to drop by. Doctors, priests and grandmothers all agreed. Horizontal meant heavenly, and not in a good way. People in the 1600s feared that lying flat let vapours, mysterious invisible mists that supposedly floated inside your body, rise up and choke you in the night. Physicians wrote about it in all seriousness, warning that the blood could stagnate or the lungs could suffocate. In truth, it was just a polite way of admitting they had no idea how the human body worked. And yet, they were deeply confident about it. So confident that noblemen would sleep in almost seated positions, with their heads cocked like wilted sunflowers, while servants tucked them in around a mound of feather cushions that could double as a siege fort. Besides, beds weren't exactly dreamy sanctuaries. The wealthy slept in them like thrones, vertical and grand, while peasants often shared one straw mattress among several family members, sometimes even with the livestock huddled nearby for warmth. You might fall asleep beside your wife, your son, and possibly a goat named Agnes. The smell alone was incentive enough to stay sitting up. And so, night after night, people dozed like weary sentinels guarding their own lungs from collapse and their souls from wandering too far from the body. There was also superstition involved, and superstition was the unofficial national pastime. Lying flat looked uncomfortably like the position used for laying out corpses. No one wanted to mimic the dead too closely, lest death himself get confused and think you were volunteering early. So families would wedge themselves against the bedpost, head elevated, hoping to trick the reaper into skipping their house altogether. It's possible this method worked, or maybe the reaper just had standards. But there was another reason people preferred to sit upright while sleeping, one that was less about ghosts and more about digestion. Supper was typically eaten late, heavy, and utterly ridiculous by modern standards. Think mutton swimming in fat, beer thick enough to chew, and the occasional helping of pie filled with something unidentifiable but probably moving. After such indulgence, reclining flat was a shortcut to agony. So many opted for the semi-upright pose of a smug owl, letting gravity handle what medicine could not. Even the furniture conspired to keep people vertical. Daybeds, sleeping chairs, and elaborate four-posters with headboards steeply inclined were common. Some even came equipped with built-in steps and rails, so you wouldn't slide too far down into the deadly danger zone of flatness. Wealthy women might sleep half-dressed, their corsets loosened but never quite removed. Because of course, You never knew when a servant, a priest, or the neighbour's cat might wander in. Privacy was optional, modesty was mandatory, and nobody trusted the night to behave itself. And then there was the sheer terror of the dark itself, before street lamps, before matches, before anyone thought to invent the idea of cosy. Darkness was not romantic. It was alive. People believed it teemed with witches, thieves, and other unmentionables that crept from the edges of the unknown. To lie down flat, defenceless, was to surrender. Sitting up, on the other hand, made you look alert, or at least capable of shrieking in time to be saved. It was less restful, yes, but considerably more dignified than being strangled by something you couldn't name. As odd as it sounds, sleeping upright became a kind of social signal too, a display of class, virtue, and proper living. Only drunkards and dogs lie flat, one pamphlet scolded. Upright sleep implied discipline and restraint, even as it left your neck in a permanent state of polite agony. People took pride in it. They would boast of how little they slept, or how stiffly they did it, as if posture could purify the soul. By the time the candles guttered low and the house fell into its uneasy hush, people were already halfway asleep, not because they were comfortable, but because exhaustion was the only sedative available. Imagine working 16 hours a day, hauling buckets, kneading bread, chopping wood, or pretending to be pious for the sake of appearances, and then returning to a bed that felt like a punishment invented by a spiteful carpenter. The lumpy straw poked through the ticking, the sheets hadn't been washed since the coronation, and something, probably alive, rustled underneath. Sitting up wasn't just tradition, it was survival with a straight spine. And then there was the matter of beds themselves being valuable pieces of property, sometimes more valuable than the people sleeping in them. A bed could be passed down in a will, like a family heirloom or a curse. Whole legal disputes broke out over who got to inherit the great bed, a term that sounds grand but usually meant a structure that groaned under its own mildew. Some were so tall they required a ladder to climb into, and once you were perched there, sitting upright was simply safer than risking a midnight tumble into whatever vermin roamed below. Gravity, after all, was unforgiving in wooden nightclothes. Even the air inside these rooms conspired against rest. Windows were small and sealed against draughts. Fireplaces smoked, filling the chamber with fumes that made every breath a small adventure. Night air was considered deadly, a sinister entity that slipped in through cracks and killed without warning. People genuinely believed the dark could seep into their lungs, and so they'd keep their windows shut, pile on blankets that smelled of damp sheep, and sit up to ensure that whatever noxious vapour floated about would have to climb uphill to reach their noses. The science was dubious, but the determination was admirable. Religious belief added its own layer of nocturnal discomfort. To sleep soundly was to invite sin, or worse, sloth. God, they believed, favoured the vigilant, and nothing said vigilance like sleeping half awake in an upright position, as if waiting for divine inspection. Monks and devout householders alike would rise at odd hours for prayers, convinced that spiritual laziness would be noticed. The upright posture helped with that too. You could spring up or at least creak upright at a moment's notice. Imagine drifting into a dream about bread only to be startled awake by the thought that God might be timing your yawn. And then, as if physical misery weren't enough, the 1600s came with visitors no one wanted. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs. The real rulers of the night. These creatures didn't care about superstition, they only cared about blood. Sitting up was again a form of resistance. It made scratching easier and visibility slightly better, assuming the candle hadn't burned out. People slept in shifts, scratching in silence, pretending they were thinking deep philosophical thoughts about mortality. Some sprinkled herbs in their bedding, lavender, rosemary or mint, not for romance, but in desperate hope the bugs would think the place smelled too civilized. For those wealthy enough to afford servants, the act of going to bed was a small theatrical event. Maids would air the bed, meaning they'd shake out the same dusty sheets that had been in use since Elizabeth's reign, and warm the covers with metal pans filled with coals. You can picture the mistress of the house, perched regally against a mountain of pillows, neck craned, eyelids heavy but defiant, like a general refusing to surrender to sleep. Her hair was bound, her nightgown ruffled, her feet cold, and her husband snoring beside her, already halfway horizontal and halfway damned. Peasants, on the other hand, didn't have such ceremony. Their nights were practical affairs. They went to bed when the fire died, not out of preference but necessity. Firewood was expensive, candles were precious, and darkness didn't care for conversation. They might share a bed with children, cousins, or the occasional traveller, everyone arranged like poorly stacked kindling. In that cramped warmth, sitting up offered space, a bit of air between faces, perhaps even a sense of dignity. After all, even if you spent the day bent over a field, it was nice to end the night pretending to be upright, however briefly. The irony is that people of the 1600s were obsessed with health, yet terrified of nearly everything that might have improved it. They feared water, distrusted fresh air, and considered fruit suspiciously frivolous. Their version of wellness was a delicate balance between prayer, bloodletting, and staying vertical. If you happened to survive the night, sitting, of course, you would rise with the dawn, joints aching, proud to have once again outwitted both death and digestion. By the late 1600s, something curious began to happen. People started getting ideas. Dangerous, decadent ideas, like the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, sleep was meant to be pleasant. This heresy began quietly, whispered through the drawing rooms of the wealthy, where comfort was starting to replace penitence as the fashionable virtue. The rich began to commission beds that encouraged, scandalously, reclining. Physicians were horrified, of course. They warned that lying flat would lead to death by congestion of the humours, a fate that sounded dreadful mostly because no one knew what it meant. But the elite, as ever, loved to ignore good advice, especially when it was expensive to do so. Beds began to grow softer, deeper, and more horizontal, like an invitation to sin and spinal ruin alike. Feathers replaced straw, down mattresses whispered of indulgence, silk sheets became a symbol of worldly triumph and itchy skin. People still kept their heads slightly raised, out of habit and lingering terror, but the angle was beginning to relax, a slow, century-long descent toward what we now call sleeping like a normal human being. It was progress, of a sort, though it looked suspiciously like laziness to older generations who insisted that discomfort built character. The introduction of the nightcap also changed everything. That floppy cone of fabric wasn't just to keep the head warm, though warmth was a side effect, but also to protect one's dignity from being mistaken for a corpse. Pale, dishevelled faces in flickering candlelight could look worryingly lifeless, and the nightcap's cheerful presence reminded everyone that the wearer was still, regrettably, alive. Some wore them with lace and ribbons, others, like scholars and ministers, chose plain linen, as if announcing to the universe, "Yes, I'm going to bed, but I remain serious." Superstition didn't vanish overnight, of course. The idea of lying flat still made some nervous. Many continued to sleep propped against headboards, particularly those of delicate health, nervous temperament, or enduring guilt. Yet a quiet revolution was underway, one led by furniture makers, tailors, and the general exhaustion of pretending to be spiritually vigilant at 3 a.m. As urban life expanded, as inns and boarding houses multiplied, and as people began to value privacy, a novel concept at the time, the act of sleep became less communal and more personal. You could, for the first time, collapse horizontally without witnesses. Meanwhile, in the countryside, habits changed more slowly. Old fears clung like cobwebs. Farmers still muttered that lying down might invite the devil, though they said this mostly to excuse falling asleep in chairs by the fire. Grandmothers continued to scold children for sleeping flat, insisting the angels couldn't tell if you were dead or just lazy. But even they began to notice that horizontal sleepers seemed to wake up slightly less grumpy, though in fairness that might have been because they were no longer inhaling their own candle smoke. As nightwear evolved, so too did the notion of what sleep looked like. The 1600s had been all about surviving the night. The 1700s would flirt with enjoying it. Illustrations from the period show elegant ladies reclining in curtained canopies, one hand draped artfully over a coverlet, as if posing for death but charging him a sitting fee. Men, too, began to indulge in bedchamber theatrics, reading by candlelight, sipping chocolate, or composing dreary poetry about their insomnia. It was the dawn of domestic vanity, when one's bed was no longer just a piece of furniture but a stage for the performance of being refined. Still, the fear never entirely disappeared. Even as beds grew wider and dreams softer, there lingered an ancestral whisper. Don't lie too flat. Don't sleep too deep. death likes it that way, and so people compromised. They slept at angles. They dreamed cautiously. They adjusted pillows and morality in equal measure. By the 1700s end and the early industrial age, humanity had finally begun to unclench. The fear of lying flat was still present, like a superstition hiding under the bed, but it was losing credibility, partly because doctors had stopped using words like vapours and humours, and partly because everyone was simply too tired from factory work to sit up all night pretending to be alert. There's only so long you can maintain moral superiority when your neck feels like firewood. And so, one by one, people began to give in to gravity. Cities were growing, soot was settling on everything, and the air inside bedrooms wasn't improving, but science was starting to replace superstition. Physicians, emboldened by something resembling evidence, began to assure the public that sleeping horizontally would not, in fact, summon the Grim Reaper. They even went so far as to recommend it, on the radical premise that the body was not designed to fold like a pocket knife. Pamphlets appeared extolling the virtues of natural repose. Of course, these pamphlets were usually written by men who had never shared a bed with a spouse, a cat, and a baby all at once. Still, the idea took root. Bed design shifted yet again. The upright coffin-like structures of the 1600s evolved into graceful four-posters, more decorative than defensive. Curtains remained, partly for warmth, but mostly because humans love to pretend we're private even when we aren't. Mattresses grew thicker, linen became fashionable, lace and embroidery flourished where once there had been rope and straw. People began lying down fully, heads cushioned on pillows rather than propped like weary gargoyles. The bed was no longer a throne of vigilance, it had become an altar of indulgence. And with comfort came vanity. The elite began to treat sleep as an art form. They commissioned portraits of themselves reclining, eyes half open, looking pensive, as if deep in thought rather than halfway to drooling. Manuals appeared on their proper posture of repose, suggesting that one's angle of slumber reflected one's breeding. Too flat and you were coarse, too upright and you were provincial. It was a delicate science, somewhere between medicine and performance. For the working class, though, sleep was less philosophical and more logistical. The industrial age demanded early mornings and long shifts. Factory whistles didn't care for elegance or posture. People came home, collapsed onto whatever surface was available, and slept however they fell. Flat, sideways, upside down. Nobody judged. The bed had finally become democratic. Everyone, rich or poor, equally horizontal by necessity. Progress, it seemed, had a sense of humour. By the 1800s, sleeping upright was mostly reserved for the ill, the elderly, and the paranoid. Doctors began prescribing it again, ironically, for those suffering from heart ailments or breathing troubles. Humanity had come full circle, rediscovering its own bad habits with professional approval this time. The difference was intent, no longer superstition, but science, which, as history often proves, can feel remarkably similar. Yet traces of the old mindset remained in language. People still spoke of sleeping like the dead, as if flatness still carried danger. Beds retained their Gothic grandeur, high frames, draped curtains, dark wood that creaked in judgment. And deep down, even as gaslights flickered and chimneys puffed, some part of the human psyche still mistrusted rest. The world had grown louder, busier, and more crowded, and lying flat, truly letting go, was once again an act of vulnerability. Perhaps that fear never really vanished. It just got better sheets. By the Victorian era, sleep had become an exhibition. No longer the nervous, upright endurance test of their 1600s ancestors, Victorians turned the act of lying down into an art form wrapped in lace, mahogany, and self-importance. Bedrooms were now temples of status. The bed was the centrepiece, vast, ornate, and just inconvenient enough to remind everyone that you were wealthy enough to own something completely impractical. Four posters draped in heavy velvet stood like stage sets awaiting an audience, which in many cases they had. Victorians loved visitors, even in places meant for solitude. There were whole etiquettes surrounding being found abed, an elegant scandal that involved just enough disarray to appear human, but not so much as to be indecent. Gone were the days of sitting upright in fear of one's lungs collapsing under mysterious vapours. Now people lay flat with theatrical abandon, necks craned gracefully on embroidered pillows, a hand draped across the chest like a fainting poet. Ironically, the upright posture did not vanish. It simply migrated to the furniture of the day. Enter the chaise longue, the fainting couch, and the drawing-room recliner, perfect for swooning dramatically or pretending to read while napping in social acceptability. The very posture that once signified terror of death had become the fashionable angle of the bored and overfed. For the Victorians, sleep and morality remained awkwardly intertwined. It was acceptable to sleep deeply, provided one woke early to be productive and properly miserable about it. Oversleeping was a sin of sloth, while undersleeping was a mark of industrious virtue. The ideal Victorian woman was supposed to drift into slumber like an angel and awaken like an unpaid servant. Men, on the other hand, were encouraged to be so busy conquering the empire that sleep became a guilty luxury. And yet, they invented entire garments just for doing it. Nightshirts with frills, quilted robes, slippers soft enough to shame a cloud. The contradiction was the point. Nighttime rituals grew elaborate. A lady might spend more time preparing for sleep than modern people spend preparing for marriage. There were oils to dab, prayers to recite, corsets to unlace, very carefully lest circulation return too suddenly and cause unseemly emotions, and hair to braid into patterns that would later resemble a bird's nest. The air would be perfumed faintly with lavender, camphor, or the peculiar odour of coal smoke drifting from the street, an intoxicating blend of cleanliness and mortality. When she finally slipped between sheets cool as reproach, she might gaze at the ceiling and think of her ancestors who slept sitting up and briefly admire their posture. Then she'd sigh and turn onto her side, a modern sinner fully horizontal. Men, meanwhile, cultivated insomnia as though it were an achievement. To be sleepless was to be intellectual, the mark of a mind too restless for the trivialities of unconsciousness. Diaries from the time are filled with complaints about sleepless nights spent pondering philosophy, finances, or the possibility that the servants were stealing the good silver again. Doctors prescribed warm milk, laudanum, or a brisk walk around the parlour to induce rest. But nothing cured a Victorian gentleman faster than self-importance. And then came the Edwardians, who took Victorian vanity and polished it with a feather duster. Bedrooms brightened, curtains lightened, fears of the supernatural dimmed beneath electric bulbs. For the first time, sleep began to flirt with the idea of comfort without guilt. Mattresses were stuffed with horsehair, or springs that squeaked like polite applause. Pillows multiplied until half the bed was dedicated to decoration. Lying down flat was no longer shameful, it was aspirational. The posture that once signalled proximity to death now symbolised the ultimate luxury, a night free of responsibility. But as civilization learned to stretch out, something curious happened. A new anxiety crept in to replace the old one. No longer terrified of dying in sleep, people began to fear not sleeping at all. The more society celebrated rest, the less anyone seemed able to achieve it. Manuals were written on the art of sound slumber, complete with stern advice on posture, diet, and prayer, which is to say, the same advice that had failed for centuries. Humanity, as ever, had traded one discomfort for another, just better dressed this time. By the dawn of the 20th century, humans had at last mastered the art of lying down, and immediately began to ruin it. The industrial world, so proud of its electricity and order, extended its reach into the night. Light bulbs banished darkness, but also banished peace. Factories now ran on shifts, and cities glowed like sleepless machines. The bedroom, once a shrine to silence, became a stage for insomnia. Humanity had finally achieved the horizontal position and promptly forgot how to rest in it. The wealthy classes were the first to notice. Newspapers fretted about modern nerves, a polite term for the creeping panic that came from progress. Doctors, now wearing clean coats instead of powdered wigs, issued new theories about why people couldn't sleep. Too much coffee, too little exercise, too many thoughts, not enough faith. Some even suggested sleeping upright again, to aid digestion or improve circulation, as if civilization were determined to march backward in comfortable slippers. A few eccentrics actually tried it, stacking pillows and dozing in armchairs, rediscovering firsthand why their ancestors looked perpetually disappointed. Bedrooms evolved once again, shedding their Victorian gloom for minimalist precision. Iron bedsteads, crisp white sheets, and the faint smell of disinfectant replaced velvet and lace. Cleanliness became the new virtue, and the upright posture of moral discipline was replaced by the flat sprawl of exhaustion. Magazines began printing idealized images of sleepers, serene, untouched, impossibly symmetrical. Sleep itself became a commodity, something to purchase in bottles and pills rather than earn through fatigue. The upright bed, once a symbol of survival, now looked like an antique form of self-punishment. Still, not everyone adapted easily. Rural families and older generations kept their old ways longer than the cities cared to admit. Many slept in narrow beds, half sitting out of habit, heads tilted forward as though listening for ghosts of centuries past. Old fears die hard, and some claim they simply breathed better that way. The superstition that lying flat could invite illness persisted, mutating into modern explanations: acid reflux, sinus congestion, bad dreams. Whatever the age, humans have always found a reason to make sleeping convenient. Then came the great modern irony, the age of comfort so complete it became unbearable. Pillows multiplied again, mattresses promised the bliss of angels, and entire industries bloomed around convincing people that rest was just one purchase away. Sleep scientists, psychologists, influencers, all selling the one thing their audience was too tired to use. Humanity, fully horizontal at last, found itself restless, fidgeting, scrolling, glowing in the dark. We had defeated the candle smoke, the superstition, the bedbugs, and the fear of death, only to discover the fear of missing out. And so, though no one admits it, the modern world occasionally circles back to the posture of the past. People nod off sitting up on trains, in office chairs, on couches, against screens. The 1600s would have been proud, not of the technology certainly, but of the posture. We've returned to sleeping sitting up, not from superstition this time, but from exhaustion so total it feels ancestral. The only difference is that now we call it power napping, as if giving fatigue a corporate title somehow redeems it. The 1600s were a century obsessed with death, and nowhere was that obsession more comfortably displayed than in the bedroom. To modern eyes, the upright sleepers of the time might look absurd, but to them it was logic wrapped in linen. Every night was a negotiation with mortality. The church bells tolled often enough to remind everyone how thin the veil was between rest and ruin, and so each household went to bed not so much to sleep as to politely test whether they'd be waking up again. Lying flat seemed an invitation to be mistaken for a corpse, and given how quickly people died back then, the mistake was not entirely theoretical. The houses themselves conspired to make slumber uneasy. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, stew, and something faintly damp that no one could identify but everyone accepted. Floors creaked like gossiping spirits, and the wind moaned through ill-fitted shutters as if demanding to be let in. Even silence wasn't quiet. It was thick, alive, and slightly accusatory. So people sat propped against bolsters and carved headboards wrapped in wool, blinking into the gloom. A candle might burn low beside the bed, its flame dancing like a nervous thought. Nobody wanted complete darkness. Darkness belonged to things that didn't ask permission. There was also the matter of medicine, or what passed for it. Physicians were certain that blood had moods, that air carried sin, and that sleep was best approached as a cautious compromise. One common remedy for night suffocation advised that a person should rest in a semi-erect posture to prevent the lungs from drowning in their own humours. Another recommended a pillow steeped in vinegar to repel malignant airs. One can only imagine the perfume of that. Health manuals described the body as a furnace, the head as a chimney, so naturally you were supposed to keep the chimney up. A simple, elegant solution, assuming you didn't mind waking with the spine of a question mark. The superstition that death might mistake a sleeper for the dead had its roots in ritual too. Corpses were laid out flat, hands crossed, candles burning at the head and feet. A tableau eerily similar to rest. The image clung to the cultural imagination. To sleep like that was tempting fate, a flirtation with the ultimate stillness. So people raised themselves on pillows, tilted their chins to the heavens, and hoped death would pass by in confusion, muttering, "No, not that one. That one's still sitting." Among the wealthy, this upright sleeping posture took on an almost theatrical dignity. Great beds stood high as altars, built of oak so dark it swallowed candlelight. Heavy curtains enclosed the sleeper like a confession booth. Within, lords and ladies slumbered in layers of nightclothes, wigs removed but pride intact. their bodies arranged like saints too tired to ascend. Servants would tiptoe in at dawn to draw the curtains, half expecting to find their masters mid-prayer or mid-demise. The difference was sometimes subtle. For the poor, upright sleeping was less ritual and more practicality. The beds were narrow, the rooms smaller, and warmth a rare privilege. Sitting up allowed several people to huddle together like stacked firewood, sharing body heat while pretending it was intentional. In cottages where smoke drifted freely and air was rationed like coin, staying half upright helped you breathe above the worst of it. Besides, lying flat meant surrendering space, and space was survival. Even the language of the time reflected this wary relationship with rest. People didn't go to sleep so much as they went to bed, as though the act of actually sleeping was optional, or even suspicious. To take rest implied a measured dose, not full immersion. Sleep was not trusted. It was courted, like a fickle guest, or endured, like a sermon. To be upright in bed meant you were still participating in life, half alert, half absent, but never careless enough to be completely gone. And so, each night in the 1600s unfolded like a small moral drama, the body yearning for rest, the mind insisting on vigilance, the candle guttering between them like a witness. People sat and nodded off in patches, waking often to stir the fire, say a prayer, or listen for noises that might or might not exist. They didn't think of it as odd, just sensible. The world was uncertain. The soul was fragile, and the only thing worse than not waking up in the morning was doing so on the wrong side of eternity. Midnight was not a single moment in the 1600s. It was a whole separate life. People rarely slept through the night as we do now. They drifted off in fits and starts, in a posture more suited for conversation than oblivion. Around the middle of the night they would awaken, not startled, but dutifully, as if night itself had scheduled an intermission. Historians later called it the first sleep and second sleep, but back then it had no such poetry. It was simply how bodies behaved in a time before clocks bullied them into continuity. A man might rouse from his half-upright slumber, shift the fire and sit staring at the embers as though expecting them to whisper advice. His wife might rise, yawn and mutter a prayer, one for the soul, one for the stomach, one to ward off witches who were said to favour those hours between 12 and 3. Some used the interval for what the church coyly called conjugal business, arguing that it was holier to attend to such matters between sleeps, when the mind was calm and the children were too groggy to notice. Others simply sat there, hands clasped, letting the silence fill the room like a fog. Outside the world moved differently. Dogs barked at nothing. Wind slipped through chimney cracks, carrying the faint smell of peat and secrets. The moon, when visible, cast everything in the colour of bone. In towns the watchman made his rounds, calling the hour as if to prove time still existed. "Past 1 o'clock and all's well," he'd cry, though well was a generous term for a century perpetually teetering between plague, famine and rumour. People heard his voice and went back to their pillows reassured. If someone was awake and alive out there, perhaps they could risk closing their eyes again. This middle watch of the night was also the hour for worry, a sacred pastime that has outlived centuries. Upright in their beds, people thought of debts unpaid, harvests uncertain, sins inadequately confessed. They prayed in low whispers, bargaining with a god who seemed, inconveniently, to keep their hours. Those with stomachs full of the evening stew might blame indigestion on demons, and it wasn't an entirely unreasonable diagnosis. The line between theology and gas was very fine indeed. Children, if they stirred, were hushed with stories, not sweet ones, but cautionary things about ghosts that crept through keyholes, or women turned into cats for spying on neighbours. Fear was a bedtime snack in the 1600s, served regularly and without apology. It kept the young respectful, the old devout, and everyone else awake enough to justify sitting up. When the second sleep finally arrived, it came not as a surrender but as a truce. People tilted their heads back against the wooden headboard, adjusted their posture into something that looked faintly penitential, and drifted again. Dreams in those hours were said to be prophetic, blessed by the stillness before dawn. In truth, they were probably just the natural result of bad air and worse diets, but that hardly mattered. A vision was a vision, even if it came from undercooked mutton. By the time the first hint of daylight crept through the shutters, the world was already stirring. Roosters, servants, chimney smoke. The sleepers straightened their spines, rubbed their eyes, and congratulated themselves on surviving another night. The sun, indifferent and late as usual, revealed what the candlelight had hidden: soot-streaked walls, tangled sheets, and expressions of quiet astonishment that they'd once again fooled death by sitting up. Morning in the 1600s didn't arrive with birdsong and optimism. It arrived like a suspicious guest knocking too early. The first pale light slid through warped shutters, painting the chamber in shades of grey that revealed far too much. The embers in the hearth had died into ashy sighs, and the air was cool enough to remind the living that they were, regrettably, still among the breathing. A person woke not with a stretch, but with a wince. Bones cracked like old floorboards, and the first thought of the day was usually disappointment that it was, in fact, another day. The upright sleepers shifted, disentangling themselves from the fortress of pillows that had kept them half vertical through the night. Servants stirred fires back to life, their footsteps soft but impatient. The mistress of the house would blink into consciousness, hair frizzed into an interpretive sculpture, and wonder if she dreamed of heaven or just smoke. Her husband might already be pretending to read scripture, though he'd only opened the book to hide his snore marks on the pages. Even the children, lumped together in their shared bed, began to stir, one rolling too far, another complaining of the elbows. Morning was not graceful. It was survival with manners. Dreams were serious business in this world, and everyone felt compelled to interpret them before breakfast. A woman who dreamed of water might fear death. One who dreamed of bread might expect company, or hunger, which amounted to the same thing. Men claimed prophetic dreams of fortune, always conveniently justifying something they'd wanted to do anyway. The church encouraged this dream decoding, but carefully. After all, too much private revelation made a person uppity. So people learned to describe their night visions in humble tones, pretending they were confused by them, even as they memorized every detail. Meanwhile, the daily rituals began with chilly precision. Those who could afford it summoned servants to bring warm water and linen cloths for washing. Those who couldn't simply splashed from a basin that looked like it hadn't been introduced to soap since the reign of Henry VIII. The faint smell of last night's stew still hung in the air, mingling with damp wool and wood smoke. Breakfast wasn't the hearty spread of modern imagination, more often stale bread dipped in ale or pottage reheated into submission. All eaten sitting upright naturally, since the posture for living mirrored the posture for sleeping, alert, slightly anxious, and never too comfortable. As the sun rose higher, windows were unshuttered, and the world outside began to prove it still existed. The street criers called out news and nonsense, cows lowed from nearby fields, and the ever-present church bells tolled as though reminding everyone that time was both merciful and relentless. Inside, the house returned to motion, fires stoked, pots hung, boots laced. The bed curtains were drawn open to air the sheets, though airing mostly meant letting the damp settle evenly across the fabric. And through it all, the memory of the night lingered. People carried their dreams, their half-rested stiffness, their vague sense of having survived something. Sleep in the 1600s wasn't restorative. It was an accomplishment. One faced the new day with the grim satisfaction of someone who had successfully cheated mortality for another 24 hours. No one said it aloud, of course. Humility was fashionable, and besides, there was work to do. But as they moved about their dim kitchens and cold courtyards, lighting fires and muttering prayers, a quiet thought fluttered through the mind like smoke. Perhaps tonight, if I sit just so, death will pass me by again. Evening arrived early in the 1600s, as though the sun itself was eager to be anywhere else. By the time the light thinned to honey, and the first chill crept beneath the door, households were already shrinking into themselves. The day's noise faded, and with it came that peculiar kind of silence only the past can manage. A silence thick enough to hear one's own pulse. It was the hour for preparation, and preparation meant the delicate art of convincing oneself that night was not the enemy. The ritual began with the fire. Someone, often the servant who feared sleep the least, would bank it carefully, coaxing the embers into a manageable glow that would last until dawn. Too much flame and the house might catch. Too little, and frost would sneak under the blankets and tap your ribs like a ghost seeking conversation. Then came the candles. each one snuffed or lit according to the room's importance. Bedrooms received only one, perhaps two if vanity demanded it. Candlelight was expensive, fickle, and notoriously untrustworthy. It flickered over faces, turning familiar features into strangers. One could understand in such light why people thought devils walked freely after sunset. The bed itself required tending, and this was a performance worthy of reverence. The mattresses were shaken, the pillows puffed, and the curtains drawn like the wings of a small private theatre. Sheets were inspected for dampness, insects, or, in less fortunate homes, evidence of rodent diplomacy. In wealthier households, a maid might warm the bed by sliding in a brass pan filled with hot coals, leaving behind a scent of scorched linen and mild terror. In poorer homes, warmth came from whoever was closest, and if that happened to be a goat, so be it. Nightclothes were another matter of dignity. A proper sleeper didn't simply collapse in the garments of the day. That would have been barbaric, and besides, night carried its own dress code. Men donned long shirts that reached their knees, dignified enough for prayer, comical enough for anything else. Women wore caps to keep their hair from tangling and their souls, presumably from escaping. The modesty of these outfits was astounding, as though people feared that even the darkness might blush. Then came the prayers. No one entered sleep without a negotiation with the divine. "If I die before I wake," they whispered, with the weary sincerity of people who truly expected to be taken up on the offer. Entire families knelt by the bed, their shadows bowing alongside them, reciting verses meant to build a barricade between themselves and whatever prowled the night. Those of higher education might add a psalm for good measure. Those of humbler standing simply muttered their own inventions, a patchwork of faith and folklore that they hoped heaven would find charming. The last sounds of evening were domestic and haunting. The sigh of a door latched, the soft rattle of shutters drawn, the faint squeal of a mouse beginning its night shift. Beds creaked as bodies arranged themselves into semi-upright postures, each person finding that delicate balance between comfort and safety. A candle burned low, casting its fragile warmth on faces already half lost to sleep. Somewhere in the dark, the world exhaled, a mixture of relief and resignation, and then the quiet settled in fully. The kind of quiet that pressed against the eardrums and made one aware of every heartbeat. Lying too flat was dangerous, of course. Everyone knew that, so pillows were adjusted, blankets folded under shoulders, and backs propped against the carved wood of the headboard. It was not a comfortable way to dream, but it was, in its own grim fashion, a reassuring one. Sitting upright in bed, one could almost pretend they were still participating in the world, not surrendering to it. They dozed in that posture, half saints, half sentries, waiting for sleep to take them gently, as if by negotiation rather than command. The fire dimmed, the candle's last flicker shuddered, and the room surrendered to its watchful dark. Somewhere between midnight and the first suggestion of dawn, the house would begin to breathe again. It wasn't loud, just the settling of timbers, the soft complaint of old wood remembering its age. But in the 1600s, any sound in the dark felt personal. Sleepers stirred in their upright nests, unsure whether the noise came from the walls, the wind, or the invisible world that everyone politely pretended not to believe in. The candle had long since drowned in its own wax, leaving only the faint orange sigh of the hearth. Shadows expanded and contracted with the fire's pulse like lungs. It was at this hour that the imagination, that disobedient tenant of the mind, paid its rent in paranoia. A creak at the door might be a thief, a draught might be a spirit. The groan of a distant ox could be mistaken for a banshee if one were feeling dramatic, and most people were. Wives shook their husbands awake to ask whether they heard it too, and the husbands, woken from shallow dreams of bread or debt, usually claimed they hadn't, then lay rigid and guilty for the rest of the night just in case. The clergy insisted that the devil was most active at this hour, not out of evidence, but because it fit the schedule. Witches, it was said, conducted their meetings while decent folk were too afraid to roll over. So when a woman woke sweating from an upright doze, her first thought wasn't discomfort, but damnation. She'd whisper a prayer, clutch a cross, and blame her palpitations on temptation. The medical explanation, had anyone asked, would have been indigestion. But in the 1600s, Satan received far more credit for poor digestion than cabbage ever did. Sometimes, though, it wasn't fear that broke the night's silence. It was sickness. The air inside those sealed rooms was thick enough to chew, and even the healthy coughed in their sleep. The sick propped themselves higher still, gasping through fevers, while family members sat nearby in the half-dark, offering broth or scripture. Physicians recommended this position, claiming it kept the vapours from drowning the chest, and for once they weren't entirely wrong, but there was a cruelty to it, watching someone try to rest while chained upright by their own breath. The line between precaution and punishment was thin in those days. Children woke too, sometimes without knowing why. A nightmare, a noise, a sense that the room was too quiet. They'd sit up, because everyone did, and whisper into the dark until a parent stirred. If comfort came, it was in the form of a rough hand and a muttered, "Go back to sleep before something hears you." The something was never defined, which made it infinitely more convincing. Those who couldn't sleep sometimes wandered. They tended the fire, checked on animals, or stepped outside for air that was no fresher, but at least less haunted. The night sky of the 1600s was vast and indifferent, a sprawl of cold stars that seemed both holy and mocking. A person standing there in their nightshirt, breath fogging the air, might feel smaller than their own fears, and yet strangely alive. Inside, the family snored, the floor creaked again, and the watcher eventually returned to his half-warm bed, reassured that nothing new had gone wrong, and when sleep returned, it came suddenly. Not a gentle fade, but a theft. The body surrendered mid-thought, chin dropping to chest, hands slack in its lap. Upright still, as though awaiting some final announcement, the sleeper re-entered that uneasy truce between rest and vigilance. The room's silence grew heavy again, like water pressing against the walls of a sinking ship. Outside, frost began to lace the windows, and the world temporarily forgot to move. Dawn in the 1600s was less an event than an intrusion. It didn't burst through the windows triumphantly. It seeped in, thin and grey, like something ashamed to be caught entering. The first pale light slipped across the floorboards and found everything just as it had left it. The clutter, the cold, the sleepers frozen in attitudes of weary piety. They looked almost like a congregation dozing through eternity. Each head drooped, each spine bent in obedience to the hour. The hearth was a dull red crater by now, its last embers clinging stubbornly to purpose. A servant, or the poorest soul available, rose to stir it back to life, coughing as the smoke reintroduced itself. The sound of iron scraping against ash was the unofficial rooster of the age. Those with less help stirred themselves, grunting, stretching arms that felt older than they were. Their necks crackled, their backs ached, and still they consoled themselves that sitting up had spared them something worse, as though a flat night's rest might have ended in the obituary column. The first movements of the morning were cautious. No one wanted to wake too quickly, lest the dream still clinging to their eyelids mistake it for resurrection. Men rubbed their faces, scratching the beginnings of another day's beard. Women straightened their caps, smoothed their linen, and looked around with the faint panic of people reintroduced to the visible world. It wasn't beauty that met them, only reality. Damp sheets, sooty walls, and a smell of boiled fabric that seemed permanent. Children were roused gently if time allowed, and less gently if it didn't. They blinked at the light, confused as to why they'd fallen asleep sitting up again, and even more confused as to why the adults pretended this was restful. The family exchanged the same morning phrases every day. "You slept?" "Aye, I did not." "Well enough." None of it meant much. The goal was to keep the ritual alive. Meaning was a luxury for evenings. Dreams were discussed in low tones, especially if they'd been unsettling, which most were. A dream of teeth falling out might mean deceit. A dream of fire, purification. A dream of falling. That was the devil trying to drag you down. Or perhaps just your head slipping from the pillow. Superstition made everything symbolic and everyone tired. The upright sleepers took their omens seriously, but not personally. After all, everyone dreamed badly. It was part of belonging to the century. Soon the morning smells began. Smoke, bread, broth, sweat. The streets outside awakened with the familiar percussion of carts and hoofbeats, and the chant of traders rehearsing their day's desperation. Inside, the air grew warmer, the sounds sharper, and the memory of the night's fears began to fade. Not gone, just shelved. Someone opened a shutter and flinched at the light. Daytime looked far too confident. As the last remnants of night receded, the sleepers fully rejoined the living. They rose from their beds with the cautious reverence of people dismounting from a relic. A few made the sign of the cross, others muttered that their bones had stiffened into prayer, and for a brief moment they sat again, upright, blinking, waiting for their hearts to remember their purpose. It was habit, yes, but also superstition. They had started the night sitting up to keep death away, and they began the morning the same way, just to be sure. The world resumed its rhythm soon enough. Fires crackled, doors opened, chickens complained, and humanity returned to the business of pretending it wasn't afraid of the dark. But every spine still remembered the posture of the night, that cautious angle between rest and resistance, where the living learned to pretend they were only resting their eyes, and not quietly proving they still had the right to open them. In the 1600s, wisdom didn't come from books, at least not the kind you could afford to own. It came from mothers, midwives, priests, and whichever neighbour shouted loudest. And when it came to sleep, everyone was an expert. Children were raised on a steady diet of bedtime rules, recited with the same gravity as scripture. Never lie flat, mothers warned, tucking their little ones in at an angle sharp enough to count as an architectural feature. The angels watch from above, and you mustn't look too ready for them. By the time those children grew up, they didn't question the logic. They simply improved upon it. Young wives scolded husbands for sprawling. Husbands, in turn, quoted doctors who insisted it was for the good of the blood. And what could be more romantic than a couple sitting bolt upright in mutual discomfort, convinced they were prolonging each other's lives? The creak of bedposts was the lullaby of virtue. Physicians, for their part, did nothing to discourage the tradition. They wrote earnestly about the perils of horizontal repose, how the humours of the body might rebel, the lungs might drown, the stomach might rise in mutiny. It was a century of imagination disguised as medicine, and people clung to it with the desperation of those who couldn't quite afford to be wrong. Even the simplest ailments, a cough, a fever, a melancholy, were prescribed the same cure. Sleep sitting, lest nature mistake your rest for surrender. Priests joined the chorus because religion never met a superstition it couldn't sanctify. Sermons warned against slothful postures that tempted death or sin, two conditions often confused. Sleeping upright, they said, kept the soul vigilant, ready should the Lord appear unannounced. And since the Lord had a habit of doing just that, in floods, plagues, and other theatrical ways, few were willing to risk being found horizontal. To sleep humbly was to live righteously. To stretch out fully was to flirt with eternal consequences. Even midwives and healers repeated the rule with a certain weary confidence. They'd pat a patient's arm and say, "Keep your head raised, dear, it keeps the bad spirits from nesting." Spirits, it seemed, were opportunistic, crawling into ears, noses, and mouths if left at rest. One could imagine the invisible world as a sort of over-enthusiastic housekeeping staff, tidying up souls that lay too still. The safest posture was vigilance, or at least something that looked like it. In every village there was at least one old woman who had perfected the art. She'd sit in bed so upright she looked embalmed, hands folded, eyes half closed, muttering prayers through cracked lips. Children would peek through the door, terrified and impressed. "That's how the good die," their mothers whispered, not realizing they were making sleep itself sound like rehearsal for the grave. The irony, of course, was that the upright sleepers often died sitting that way, perfectly fulfilling their own advice. And so the posture passed on, not because it was comfortable or even sensible, but because it was safe in theory. Safety, in the 1600s, was always theoretical. People trusted the wisdom of the uncomfortable, as though pain itself were a credential. A bed that hurt your neck but saved your soul was considered excellent design. Comfort, they thought, was for the weak, or the French, which was roughly the same insult. Every household became its own university of insomnia. Beliefs about sleep were traded like recipes. Boil herbs before bed, never sleep on your left side, pray with your eyes half open. No one remembered who made the rules, but everyone agreed on the consequences of breaking them. The body, it seemed, required discipline even in unconsciousness. The night was no excuse for letting one's guard down, and those who lay flat like the dead were sure to join them sooner or later. Sleep in the 1600s wasn't private. It was a public performance that merely happened in private rooms. People spoke about it the next morning with the same pride or pity that others reserve for crops or weather. I slept upright as always, one might declare, the way someone today boasts of fasting. To be seen as a flat sleeper, someone careless enough to recline like a corpse, was an invitation for gossip. "She lies too still," neighbours would whisper, eyes wide with moral concern. "It isn't natural." The devil likes them easy to find. Market stalls buzzed with such chatter. Housewives traded bread and judgment in equal measure. "My husband slept sitting straight as a bishop," one might brag, "didn't move once through the whole night." "Ah," another would sigh, "mine slumped halfway. I told him he'd wake cursed or stiff-necked, which, come to think of it, he did." There were no sleep doctors in the 1600s, just an army of opinionated women who knew more about proper posture than any physician dared publish. In wealthier circles, sleep became a matter of etiquette. Courtiers and gentry prided themselves on elegant restraint, even in unconsciousness. Guests might compliment a host's sleeping posture, the way one might praise fine silver. "You looked almost saintly," they'd say after sharing a chamber, which was not unusual in an age where privacy was as rare as soap. One could ruin a reputation by snoring too loudly, or, worse, being caught draped flat across the mattress in unholy abandon. Decorum, after all, didn't end when the eyes closed. It merely shifted angles. Among clergy, upright sleep was practically a job requirement. Monks, friars, and priests all championed the virtue of wakeful rest. "He who sleeps half sitting," one preacher intoned, "keeps his soul half ready." They even constructed wooden prayer benches with high backs, upon which the devout could doze without technically reclining. It was theology by furniture, proof that salvation could be achieved with the right carpentry. The monks who managed to nod off while still clutching a rosary were considered paragons of discipline. Those who drooled were merely human. Even bed-making became a kind of bragging right. Servants in grand houses would boast of arranging pillows at the perfect angle for godly repose. Some noble women demanded their pillows be embroidered with Bible verses to deter nocturnal temptation, though one suspects the temptation was more of boredom than sin. Visitors who caught a glimpse of such sanctified bedding would nod approvingly. "Ah, upright as virtue itself," they'd murmur, as though posture alone could cleanse the soul. Of course, not everyone took the custom seriously. There were cynics, there always are, who muttered that upright sleeping was just another excuse to feel superior. Tavern talk was full of it. "You can keep your holy posture," a farmer might grumble over ale. "If God wanted me sitting all night, he'd have made sleep in chairs." The laughter that followed was always nervous, the kind that checks over its shoulder for lightning. Joking about sleep was nearly as risky as joking about death, and in most cases they were the same topic. But the truth was that everyone obeyed the same logic in the end. Sleep wasn't rest, it was responsibility. To sit upright was to participate in your own continued existence. To lie flat was to flirt with fate. The posture itself was a social contract, an unspoken agreement between body and reputation. Stay vertical, stay respectable, stay alive. And so, each night, across towns and fields and grand estates, people arranged themselves into sitting silhouettes. Thousands of small moral monuments flickering in the half-light of tallow candles, each one nodding toward dawn and pretending they weren't afraid. Why medieval people drank beer instead of water. Imagine the streets of medieval London, mud, muck and mystery all sloshing together in one rancid stew. A man could lose his boot in it if he wasn't careful, and sometimes his dignity too. The air hung thick with a scent that was part fish, part horse, and part something died last week. You could dip a bucket into the Thames if you fancied an early death, but most people had learned their lesson after their third bout of something politely called the flux. So they reached instead for beer, that golden saviour of the digestive tract. Not because they wanted to get drunk, though that was a happy accident, but because the water could kill you faster than a knight's sword. Beer, on the other hand, might only embarrass you. People didn't drink beer because they loved the taste. Oh no, most of it was cloudy, warm, and about as appetizing as bathwater with ambition. But it was safe, which was saying something in a world where cleanliness was a rumour. You see, when the water ran through filth, and the filth ran through everything else, boiling and fermenting became a kind of accidental witchcraft. The process killed the nasties you couldn't see, though no one quite knew that yet, and left behind something vaguely drinkable. Children drank it, monks drank it, pregnant women drank it. Babies probably teethed on tankards. If you wanted to live, you brewed. If you wanted to die, you drank straight from the stream and waited your turn. The alehouse was the medieval version of social media. Everyone gathered to share news, lies, and the occasional plague update. The ale was weak, the conversation weaker, and the smell absolutely unforgettable. But it was safer than the street, and that was enough. People sipped their small ale from dawn till dusk, pretending not to notice the flies doing backstrokes in their mugs. Meanwhile, a few brave souls graduated to strong ale, the medieval equivalent of saying, "I've given up." The stronger brew was reserved for feasts, funerals, or moments of despair, which, in fairness, were often the same event. The real heroes of this beer-soaked world were the brewsters, the women who stirred their kettles like sorceresses, coaxing life out of barley and stale hope. They wore aprons stiff with grain dust, hair tied back, and expressions that said, "Don't you dare tell me how to stir." Their cottages steamed like witches' dens, pots bubbling, cats lurking, and children sneaking tastes when they thought no one was looking. Their brew might have been cloudy, unpredictable, and occasionally explosive, but no one complained. It kept the village alive and, more importantly, only mildly hungover. When the tax collectors arrived, these women were accused of running unlicensed alehouses. In truth, they were running civilization from their kitchens. Meanwhile, the church, those pious experts on sin and subtle hypocrisy, was brewing its own batches behind monastery walls. Beer, they decided, was entirely acceptable, so long as it was consumed in moderation. And by moderation they meant constantly. Fasting was no problem when you could drink your calories. Monks took vows of silence, but their burps echoed through cloisters with the resonance of holy bells. Some even claimed that beer was a divine gift, which was convenient theology for men who drank 10 pints a day for health reasons. God, they said, must have wanted them hydrated. In castles, nobles took beer to a whole new level of pretentiousness. Their brews were spiced, honeyed, and poured into silver cups by servants who were strictly forbidden from looking too thirsty. After banquets, lords slumped against pillars, declaring the ale excellent, which was easy to say after forgetting how to stand. Meanwhile, the servants polished the floor with their sleeves, muttering prayers for sturdier livers. Even the knights joined in, cheering, boasting, and singing songs about honour, none of which survived the morning hangover. As for the poor souls who preferred water, they didn't last long enough to start trends. Wells were often poisoned, sometimes by accident, sometimes by malice, and sometimes by whatever had crawled into them and given up. Villagers whispered that rivers had tempers, spirits, and occasionally indigestion. To brew beer was to defy those spirits, to take the filth of the world and make it, well, drinkable filth. Every tankard was a quiet rebellion against the universe's cruel sense of humour. People toasted survival with the same enthusiasm others reserved for weddings, and make no mistake, beer was everywhere. Morning, beer. Noon, beer. Midnight, still beer. It was breakfast, lunch, supper, and spiritual coping mechanism all in one. The water was out to kill you, the church was out to save you, and the beer was somewhere in between, offering comfort, mild dizziness, and the illusion that everything was fine. And perhaps it was, in its own foamy way. For in a world ruled by plague, filth, and superstition, a little warm ale was the only dependable friend a person had. By the late medieval years, beer had become less of a drink and more of a lifestyle choice, specifically the kind of lifestyle that involved swaying slightly when you walked, and forgetting where you put your shoes. Taverns overflowed with men who'd promised their wives they'd only stay for one quick pint, a phrase that historians now recognise as the greatest lie of the Middle Ages. The ale was cheap, the gossip was free, and dignity was strictly optional. Some drank until they wept about lost love, others drank until they forgot they'd ever been in love. Either way, by the end of the night someone was singing off-key, someone was asleep on the floor, and someone else was swearing they'd never touch ale again, right before ordering another round. The church, of course, saw this and began to panic, not because people were dying, but because they were enjoying themselves. Sermons were preached about the dangers of drink, how ale led to sin, sloth, and the occasional regrettable dance. Priests thundered from pulpits that beer was the devil's brew, though one suspects they did so with mild hangovers. Meanwhile, the monasteries themselves were exporting barrels of their own ale at a tidy profit. Do as we say, not as we drink, might as well have been carved over the abbey doors. But for every holy finger wagged, there were 10 new alehouses opening by the road. Some were no more than a smoky corner of a cottage, with a single bench and a leaky barrel, while others became full-fledged taverns, buzzing with laughter and the clatter of tankards. The signs hung outside with pictures instead of words. Most people couldn't read, but they could certainly recognise a mug of beer painted over a door. Inside, deals were made, songs were sung, and on especially good nights, chairs were thrown. Medieval life was short, brutal and smelly. Beer was the only reliable antidote to all three. Of course, there were consequences. Town officials started grumbling about public drunkenness, which is rich coming from men who are usually the first to stumble home after dark. Some tried imposing curfews or taxes, hoping to sober the townsfolk through sheer bureaucracy. It didn't work. People simply started brewing at home again, turning every kitchen into a small-scale brewery and every wife into an amateur chemist. Fires broke out, kettles exploded, and a few unfortunate souls learned the hard way that boiling beer in a closed pot creates more excitement than anyone needs. Still, they brewed. Because what else could they drink? Certainly not the water. It still killed faster than the ale ever could. Even the upper classes weren't immune to the lure of the mug. Nobles began commissioning fancy beers, flavoured with honey, herbs, or whatever happened to be lying around that didn't bite back. Imported hops appeared, and suddenly everyone fancied themselves a connoisseur. "Ah, yes," they'd say, swirling their tankard like it was fine wine. "I can taste the barley's melancholy." Servants rolled their eyes in the background, knowing the Lord would be singing nonsense to the fireplace within the hour. But beneath all this brewing and brawling, there lingered something oddly noble about beer. It was the drink of the people, simple, flawed, but dependable. When famine hit, beer kept bellies full. When plague swept through towns, beer offered the illusion of safety. It didn't cure anything, but it dulled the fear long enough to get through another day. For a world that constantly reeked of uncertainty and actual sewage, that was enough. And so, the taverns stayed full, the sermons grew louder, and the streets stayed sticky with spilled ale. Every tankard clinked in defiance of fate, every gulp a kind of prayer. Let this not be the last one. And for most, it wasn't, at least not that night. Tomorrow they'd wake to pounding heads, dry mouths, and a vague sense of shame, but also miraculously they'd wake, which, in the medieval world, was a victory worth toasting. By the time the 15th century rolled around, beer had become so indispensable that it was practically its own form of currency. If a man didn't have coin, he could pay in ale. If he didn't have ale, he could work for it. Wages, debts, even bribes. Everything could be settled over a pint or 12. It wasn't uncommon for a village meeting to begin sober and end with everyone agreeing to build a bridge no one remembered discussing. Economically speaking, beer was liquid gold, if gold made you belch and forget your shoes. The brewers themselves began to organise, forming guilds that operated somewhere between a business association and a mildly tipsy secret society. They took themselves very seriously, wearing badges, holding feasts, and enforcing standards of quality, which mostly meant ensuring no one watered down the beer too much. Any brewer caught cheating the foam could face heavy fines. Or worse, public shame. Being a bad brewer in a medieval town was no small scandal. People didn't riot over politics back then. They rioted when the ale ran out. But wherever there's money, there's mischief. The more profitable brewing became, the more certain people wanted to control it. Local lords imposed taxes, pretending it was for public welfare, which everyone knew meant my new stable. The church took its slice naturally, calling it a holy contribution, though the only thing sacred about it was the amount. Even kings got involved, declaring that only licensed brewers could sell ale, conveniently those who paid the most for the privilege. Meanwhile, the humble brewster women who had once fed whole towns were quietly pushed aside. Their craft became men's work, and before long, those same men were bragging about perfecting recipes that had existed for generations, recipes stolen from the very women they now banned from the trade. In the cities, brewing took on an industrial flavour. Whole streets reeked of yeast and smoke, barrels rolled over cobblestones, and apprentices scurried about with more enthusiasm than understanding. Water was fetched, boiled, strained and fermented until the neighbourhood smelled like an enthusiastic bread loaf. The townsfolk didn't mind. Better to breathe beer fumes than whatever else was floating in the air. By this point, ale wasn't just the safer drink, it was the only drink anyone trusted. Even when the water looked clear, people eyed it like it had personal vendettas. Naturally, all this brewing success invited moral panic. Religious reformers began wailing that alehouses were dens of sin where men forgot their duties and women forgot their reputations. They weren't entirely wrong, plenty of both were misplaced nightly. But still, the alehouse was the medieval person's therapy session, confession booth, and entertainment venue all rolled into one. When you worked 6 days a week and lived in a house smaller than a stable, a mug of beer wasn't indulgence, it was survival with bubbles. Authorities tried to limit consumption through laws that read like the rantings of a disappointed parent. No ale shall be served after curfew. No man shall be found drunken in public view. No woman shall sell ale without the king's permission. Every rule was broken within hours. People didn't even pretend to obey. It was hard to care about moral reform when you'd spent your day knee-deep in mud, or worse, your neighbour's waste. Beer softened the edges of misery, and that was worth every sermon and fine. Still, reformers never gave up. They warned that drunkenness led to gambling, fighting, and fornication, which, to be fair, it often did. But the same could be said of boredom. So the people drank, and the more they were told not to, the more they raised their mugs in rebellious cheers. For a peasant who'd seen famine, plague, and taxation all in the same season, sinful pleasure was a luxury worth clinging to. And in the quiet hours after the taverns emptied, when the candles had guttered out and the streets lay slick with spilled ale, the real joke of it all revealed itself. The same clergy who thundered against drunkenness would be nursing their own headaches in the morning. The same lords who taxed beer by the barrel would toast each other with it at supper. The same moralists who condemned the alehouses would sneak in through the back door after dusk. Hypocrisy was, it turned out, the only thing consumed more freely than beer. Hops slipped quietly into the medieval brew like an unexpected houseguest, one who arrived without knocking and then refused to leave. At first, people weren't sure what to make of these bitter little flowers. Ale had always been flavoured with whatever herbs were lying around, Groot they called it, a cheerful combination of plants that varied wildly depending on who grew them and how optimistic they were feeling. Groot made ale taste earthy, spicy, and often vaguely medicinal, like something you'd drink if you were confident your body would handle the consequences. When hops arrived, though, they changed everything. They kept beer from spoiling too fast, extending its shelf life in a way that made merchants weep with joy and housewives sigh with relief. Suddenly, beer didn't go sour after a day. It could last weeks. This meant fewer frantic brew days, fewer exploding barrels, and more time to panic about other things, like plague, famine, or why God hated them this year. Naturally, anything that brought stability was met with immediate suspicion. Beer that didn't expire quickly, unnatural. Some swore hops were the devil's herb. Others said it made men melancholy. One chronicler called hopped beer a sorrowful drink, though it's unclear if he was describing the taste or the morning after. Brewers began arguing like theologians over the difference between ale, no hops, and beer with hops, though the common folk just pointed at the nearest mug and asked, "Will it kill me?" If the answer was probably not, they drank it. It didn't matter what it was called. Most medieval people were too busy trying to survive their own bodily functions to bother with semantics. Still, hops spread like gossip. Every year, more breweries adopted the new method. Hopped beer travelled well, which made it an instant favourite among soldiers, sailors and merchants. Anyone doomed to spend long stretches away from home, ideally without dying. Barrels of beer crossed borders, sailed seas, and were occasionally used to settle disputes that might otherwise have required violence. Even monarchs paid attention. If a drink could last months in a cellar, it could be taxed. And once it could be taxed, it was suddenly very respectable. Kings who once ignored brewers now courted them like nervous suitors. The church, of course, followed suit, taking their cut with suspicious enthusiasm. God apparently approved so long as he received a percentage. As brewing scaled upward, so did the drama. Professional breweries sprang up in towns, with giant kettles so large a grown man could fall into one, and occasionally did. Brewing accidents became a grim form of local entertainment. A careless apprentice might open the wrong valve and flood the floor with hot wort, which was considered both tragic and, depending on who you asked, delicious. Some monasteries became famous for their beer, attracting pilgrims whose devotion was suspiciously enthusiastic. They prayed, yes, but only after sampling several pints of the holy brew to make sure their souls were properly lubricated. Medieval faith was nothing if not practical. Meanwhile, the taverns had evolved from smoke-filled huts into bustling institutions that ran smoother than most governments. Some were so well known that travellers sought them out like sacred shrines. A good tavern offered ale, a corner to sleep in, and the guarantee that no one would ask too many questions about why you were travelling with only one boot and a haunted look in your eye. People came to drink, of course, but they stayed to gossip, gamble, and briefly forget their crushing poverty. The alehouse was the true beating heart of a medieval town. It was where marriages were arranged, friendships were betrayed, and occasionally very poor decisions were made with great enthusiasm. But with all this increased production came rules, endless rules. Governments began regulating beer with the zeal of bored clerks. Prices were fixed, ingredients were monitored. A wrong measure of malt could lead to a fine, a curse, or a very awkward conversation with local authorities. Inspectors patrolled the streets, tasting beer to ensure its quality. The job sounds glamorous until you remember medieval beer hygiene involved buckets, sweat, and the occasional mouse. Still, these brave souls drank in the name of public service, staggering from tavern to tavern with a noble slur. Some were very dedicated, others possibly more so. With hops making beer last longer, something else began to shift. People started trusting their drink more than their neighbours. Water remained the suspicious cousin no one wanted to talk to, while beer was the friendly uncle who always remembered your birthday and occasionally fell asleep in a chair. Beer had become not just a beverage, but a shield against sickness, despair, and the crushing realization that your house smelled faintly of goat. Where water could betray you, beer stayed loyal. It might give you a headache, but it wouldn't poison you, intentionally anyway. That was more than could be said for many medieval relationships. And so, medieval life marched forward, half sober, half stumbling, on a river of beer that flowed through every part of society. It seeped into religion, politics, daily routine, and the occasional questionable decision. The people trusted it more than holy water, drank it more than milk, and celebrated it like a dear friend. In a world where everything seemed designed to kill them, beer stood as their bewildering saviour, bubbling with yeast, grain, and a little bit of hope. Medieval festivals, of course, were the perfect excuse to drink even more beer, as if anyone needed an excuse. A holy day, a market day, the day after a particularly rough Tuesday, any of these were perfectly valid occasions to gather in the town square and drink until the world softened at the edges. Barrels were rolled out like honoured guests, tapped with reverence, and emptied with astonishing efficiency. At fairs, jugglers tossed knives, musicians played lopsided tunes, and someone's uncle inevitably tried to dance on a table. The beer encouraged all sorts of questionable hobbies, singing loudly, laughing too much, and occasionally challenging livestock to foot races. The livestock usually won. Every season had its own festival, and every festival had its own beer. Spring brought lighter brews to celebrate surviving winter. Nothing improves gratitude like remembering you nearly froze to death. Summer offered slightly stronger ale because the heat made everyone cranky enough to need sedation. Autumn boasted harvest brews so hearty they could pass as soup, and winter brought the strongest of all, thick spiced drinks that warmed your insides and erased your memory. By the end of each season, people celebrated the fact that, miraculously, they were still alive. Beer, like a loyal but chaotic companion, was always there to help them forget the other half of the miracle. These revelries came with superstitions too, because nothing says responsible drinking like blaming invisible forces for your hangover. People believed that leaving a little beer in your mug kept wicked spirits away. Others swore that if you toasted without making eye contact, you'd anger the elves, who would repay you by hiding your boots and possibly your dignity. Some inns even hung charms above their doors, supposedly to keep out demons and tax collectors, both of whom were known to ruin an evening. The charms worked about as well on tax collectors as you'd expect. Beer seeped into weddings and funerals alike. At weddings, a barrel would be ceremonially opened, and relatives would drink to the happiness of the couple, then loudly speculate on how long that happiness would last. The bride and groom could only hope the beer outlasted the gossip. At funerals, mourners drank to the memory of the deceased, and then debated whether the beer was better or worse than the person they'd buried. Nothing softened grief like comparing Uncle Harold's personality to the qualities of a moderately brewed ale. Some towns even held competitions to see which tavern could serve the best beer, though judging criteria usually involved which brew made the fewest people go blind. Winners gained prestige. Losers became local legends for entirely different reasons. Songs were written about especially good batches, though even more songs were written about especially disastrous ones. One popular ballad told the tale of a brewer so bad his beer was accused of witchcraft, not because it was magical, but because it inspired uncontrollable weeping and spontaneous dancing. The authorities investigated before concluding it was simply terrible craftsmanship. Then there were the wandering drinkers, travelling bards who claimed they could tell your future after a few pints. Their predictions were vague at best. "You will meet someone," they'd say, or "the weather may trouble you." If that wasn't helpful enough, they'd add, "have another drink." People believed them anyway, because it was hard to argue with a man who just serenaded a loaf of bread. And if his predictions didn't come true, no one remembered well enough to complain. Beer made for very forgiving clients. In monasteries, where silence was supposedly golden, festivals could get flexible. Brewmasters toiled in stone-walled rooms, producing beer so beloved that pilgrims sometimes forgot what they were praying for. On feast days, monks poured out holy ale in quantities that made their vows of moderation look more like light suggestions. The festivities blurred the line between devotion and indulgence, which most agreed was a comfortable place to live. Some abbeys even gained fame across the land, not for their piety, but for their ability to turn grain into liquid cheer better than anyone else. Devout travellers came to see relics, and stayed for refills. Beer managed to weave itself into nearly every tradition: births, deaths, harvests, and the occasional spontaneous brawl. If something important happened, people drank. If something terrible happened, people drank more. Medieval life was unpredictable, occasionally cruel and always filthy. Beer was the soothing balm that convinced everyone they could survive another day. It was cheaper than a doctor, tastier than a prayer, and far less judgmental than a neighbour. Whether beneath the vaulted ceilings of a monastery or the sagging roof of an alehouse, mugs clunked together with the same hopeful rhythm. May tomorrow be kinder than today. And if tomorrow wasn't, well, the next barrel was already waiting, foaming with equal parts comfort and regret. Physicians, those brave medieval souls armed with leeches, Latin, and a concerning level of confidence, swore by beer almost as much as the common folk. In an age when medical knowledge was roughly as reliable as weather predictions from a squirrel, beer became a prescription for just about everything. Got a fever? Drink beer. Stomachache? Beer. Melancholy mood? Beer. But maybe sit near sunlight so the demons can find their way out. Even surgeons recommended ale before procedures, partly to numb pain and partly to distract the patient from realizing the barber surgeon was also holding bloody scissors. Some doctors insisted that certain beers had humours: warm, cold, moist and dry, just like the body. If your humours were out of balance, which they usually were, a doctor would recommend a carefully chosen brew to fix you right up. Too much black bile? A dark ale? Too much phlegm? A lighter one? Too many questionable decisions? Strong ale. Of course, the cure usually made the symptoms worse, but by then, the patient was too tipsy to complain. Medical success was measured by survival or silence, and beer conveniently encouraged both. Even childbirth was not exempt from the healing power of ale. Midwives often gave labouring women warm beer because it was thought to strengthen the body. Though more likely, it just made everyone care less about how much screaming was happening. New mothers received beer to replenish their strength, and newborns were sometimes given a drop to help them sleep, which they did, possibly because they'd briefly forgotten they'd just entered medieval life. Theologians might have debated souls, but mothers knew the true miracle was getting a baby to stop crying long enough to take a nap. Inside the household, beer was as essential as firewood, bread, and at least one relative who never helped but had opinions anyway. Brewing was often a weekly affair, more often when the water started to smell suspicious, which was most of the time. Women tended the kettles, stirring constantly, trying not to think about how many insects were enjoying the warmth. Cats were the silent guardians of the grain. though occasionally they became a little too curious and required rescuing before they became an accidental ingredient. Some families even had favourite yeast strains, passed down through generations like heirlooms, because nothing says family tradition like microorganisms with commitment. Beer at home functioned as beverage, food, and emotional support. Breakfast meant bread dipped in ale. Lunch meant ale with more ale. And dinner, naturally, was beer, accompanied by something that might once have been a vegetable. Children drank small ale, weak enough that it merely made them calm rather than philosophical. Fathers drank stronger beer and became very philosophical indeed, pondering life, death, and why the cow kept staring at them. Mothers drank whatever was left, often preferring it to the conversation at the table. Inevitably, beer sometimes went bad. Maybe the yeast misbehaved, or the barrel leaked, or someone annoyed the brewing gods. When this happened, households reacted with the gravity of a national crisis. Remedies ranged from sensible to lunatic. Some added herbs, rosemary or sage, to revive the brew. Others prayed over it, inviting saints to intervene in their hour of frothy need. A few swore by dangling charms near the barrels, believing that malicious spirits sometimes soured the beer out of sheer spite. If none of these worked, they might pour a bit on the ground as an offering to placate whatever supernatural thing had done them dirty. In the most desperate cases, people brought in beer doctors, local experts whose training consisted mainly of having brewed a few good batches and owning a confident moustache. These men, and occasionally women, sniffed, tasted, frowned meaningfully, and then declared the beer either revivable or deeply cursed. If revivable, they added more yeast or herbs and told the family to pray harder. If cursed, they recommended disposal, which usually meant giving it to the neighbour with questionable hygiene and a high tolerance for disappointment. Despite all attempts at preservation and prayer, spoiled beer remained a tragic part of medieval life. People mourned a ruined batch more deeply than they mourned most relatives, and with better reason. Relatives often came back asking for things. Spoiled beer, however, was gone forever. It was a sobering reminder, if you'll forgive the irony, that nothing in medieval life was guaranteed except death, taxes, and at least one chicken stealing your dinner. But even when it turned sour or strange things floated to the top, beer still represented a glimmer of hope, an everyday miracle conjured from grain, water, and stubbornness. It gave people strength when food was scarce, courage when life was hard, and enough distraction to make them forget how often life stomped on their toes. Beer was the silent witness to both celebration and sorrow, an unjudging companion at every table, so long as it behaved itself. Work in medieval times, whether in fields, workshops or kitchens, was a long, repetitive dance with exhaustion, and beer played the role of both partner and chaperone. Labourers began their mornings not with water or tea, but with a mug of small ale, enough to lubricate stiff joints and numb the dread of another day spent coaxing crops from uncooperative soil. It filled the belly when bread was scarce and made the sun feel like less of a personal insult. Farmers hoed their rows with steady if slightly wobbly hands, shepherds hummed tuneless songs to their sheep, and millers spent the day enveloped in flour dust and comfortable disappointment. All of this was made more tolerable by the promise of ale at midday, followed by, if God was merciful, more ale in the evening. Naturally, this meant the workplace was a lively scene. Fields echoed with the sound of chatter and occasional arguments about whose turn it was to fetch the next jug. Workshops rang with the clink of tools, the muttering of craftsmen, and sporadic belching, often interpreted as satisfaction with one's work. Beer softened tempers just enough to stop fights from breaking out over trivial matters like tool sharing, or whose goat was eating whose turnips. Sure, someone might occasionally nap on the job after a generous lunchtime pint, but everyone agreed that productivity was overrated, especially when your boss was probably tipsy too. When the sun dipped low and the day's work ended, if it ever truly ended, beer ushered in the evening. Families gathered around smoky hearths, trading stories and complaints about work, weather, and neighbours who were definitely stealing chickens. Fathers drank strong ale, becoming progressively wiser with each sip. Mothers drank with the solemn resignation of people who knew they'd be cleaning up spilled mugs at dawn. Children sipped tiny cups of small ale and quietly prayed to someday taste something that wasn't made of barley. Nighttime in medieval towns was its own brand of chaotic serenity. Streets were dim, lit only by candles or torches that flickered, with all the enthusiasm of underpaid workers. People stumbled home from taverns singing songs that no one remembered composing. Some swore they saw spirits lurking in alleyways, others swore at the alleyways themselves for tripping them. Cats prowled, seeking scraps or spiritual enlightenment, while dogs lay sprawled in the mud, snoring louder than knights in armour. Beer made the night softer, or at least made everyone care less about how frightening it truly was. Travelling during this era was an adventure no sane person would attempt sober. Roadways were little more than rutted paths that turned into swamps whenever it rained, which was often. Travellers carried beer with them in jugs or barrels strapped awkwardly to carts. Water from roadside streams was a gamble, but beer was a trusted companion. A mouthful could steady nerves when passing through forests whispered to be haunted. 2 mouthfuls might make those whispering trees seem friendly. Inns along the routes offered food of questionable provenance, and beds stuffed with straw that poked like guilty memories. But the ale flowed, and that was enough. With enough beer, even a flea-riddled mattress felt like a noble sacrifice to comfort. But beer's greatest test came during community events that spiralled out of control in spectacular fashion. Every now and then, a village would celebrate a wedding, a harvest, or the astonishing discovery that the local well hadn't poisoned anyone this week. Barrels were rolled out, the drinking began, and restraint was politely excused. Dancing erupted, featuring moves that looked suspiciously like falling but with commitment. Elders tried to supervise but quickly abandoned the effort and joined in, muttering something about reliving their youth. Chickens fled, goats screamed. The village priest sighed, sipped his ale, and accepted that morality would resume tomorrow, probably. Sometimes these gatherings made local history for better or worse. One village became famous for attempting to brew a beer so strong it could wake the dead. While the dead remained mercifully still, half the town passed out and the other half claimed to have seen a ghost who smelled suspiciously like barley. Another community once tried to baptize a barrel of beer, believing it would bless the next harvest. The barrel leaked, the priest slipped, and the field remained unimpressed. Still, the townsfolk declared the ritual a success because they'd drunk the rest of the barrel afterward and felt very blessed indeed. There were, on rare occasions, events so chaotic they became cautionary tales. Once, a brewer's horse kicked over a lantern during a festival, igniting a small fire. Rather than flee, the drunkest villagers attempted to extinguish it by throwing their mugs of beer onto the flames. Their logic was impeccable. Beer saves lives. Unfortunately, so little beer actually reached the fire, and so much reached nearby revellers, that the blaze grew, consuming a stack of hay and singeing the pride of the local blacksmith. The village rebuilt, eventually naming the new square Ale's End to honour the day beer almost saved them. Almost. Yet even when disaster struck, beer offered comfort. When barns collapsed, when plagues crept in, when taxes increased, beer was there. It dulled sorrow, fueled celebration, and muddled memory just enough to let people breathe. They toasted their hopes, and mourned their losses with the same worn mugs, believing, perhaps wisely, that there was no sorrow so deep or joy so bright that a little beer couldn't soften its edges. Gender and beer had a complicated relationship, though complicated is putting it kindly, more like a long frothy argument conducted over several centuries. In the early days, brewing was squarely women's work. Every home had its ale wife, a title that sounded respectable until the church decided it wasn't. These women brewed for their families, their neighbours, and occasionally anyone who looked thirsty enough to pay. Their methods were part science, part superstition, and part stubborn guesswork. They stirred their kettles while muttering charms, kept cats to guard the grain, and wore tall pointed hats, mostly for visibility in crowded markets, though later people would have some thoughts about that particular fashion choice. At first everyone adored them. A good alewife meant a happy village, fewer funerals, and a collective sense that life, while terrible, could still be toasted. But the moment beer became profitable, men suddenly discovered they'd always been passionate about brewing. The same alewives who had fed entire towns were now accused of witchcraft, because apparently any woman who could make men feel warm and dizzy without touching them must be in league with Satan. Pointed hats, witchy, cats, familiars, broomsticks used to sweep spilled grain, clearly evidence of midnight flights. The irony was delicious, though the women probably didn't appreciate it while standing on trial. Many were pushed out of business, replaced by respectable male brewers who somehow managed to make the same beer taste twice as smug. Even so, the women's legacy lingered. Many of the brewing customs, the songs sung while stirring, the rituals of tapping the first barrel, the idea that beer could heal, were born from their hands. In every bubbling pot and every frothy mug, a whisper of their old magic remained. Some said you could tell when a brew had been blessed by a woman's touch. It foamed just right, smelled faintly of honey, and didn't turn sour overnight. Others insisted that was nonsense, but they drank it anyway just to be sure. As brewing passed more into male hands, beer etiquette emerged, or rather tried to. There were rules for drinking, which no one followed, and toasts for every occasion, which everyone exaggerated. A man was expected to drink deeply but not fall over, unless his host did first, in which case it became a friendly competition. Women of good standing were expected to sip modestly, which they did until no one was looking. Drinking was both a social art and a public sport. A person's reputation could rise or fall based on their ability to hold their ale and their tongue. Some towns even had informal titles like Ale Champion or the Barrel King, bestowed on those who could drink the most without losing their balance, or their clothes. And oh, the myths that surrounded brewing. Some believed every batch had a beer spirit living inside it, a tiny invisible creature who decided whether your ale would taste divine or like a pond accident. Brewers left offerings, bits of bread, drops of honey, or the occasional muttered apology for cursing during the boil. A few swore that singing to the mash made it stronger, though this depended greatly on who was singing. Others claimed that if a cat sneezed during the fermentation, the beer would be blessed. If the brewer sneezed, however, it was considered doomed. People had entire belief systems based on the behaviour of their pets. Superstitions evolved alongside failures. When a brew went bad, it wasn't blamed on science. No, it was fairies, witches, or ill wind. One tale told of a brewer who offended a saint by watering down his ale. The next morning his barrels were empty, his cellar smelled like brimstone, and his wife refused to speak to him for a week. Another story warned that spilling beer angered household spirits who would then hide your socks or sour your next batch in revenge. These myths may have sounded absurd, but they gave people comfort. After all, it's easier to forgive a mischievous sprite than to admit you forgot to clean your brewing vat. Etiquette also dictated who paid for the next round, a rule that inevitably led to centuries of arguments and several small wars. If a man invited you to drink, he paid, unless he pretended to forget, in which case everyone else pretended to forgive him while quietly plotting his social demise. Refusing to drink with someone was considered an insult. Refusing to stop drinking was considered tradition. Toasts multiplied like rabbits. To your health, to our fortune, to forgetting this day ever happened. The most popular toast, of course, was simply again. In this tangled web of superstition, social code, and mild intoxication, beer became more than a drink. It was a mirror. How you brewed it, shared it, or abused it said everything about who you were. Nobles drank for display, priests for endurance, peasants for relief, and alewives for survival. Each believed, with varying degrees of inaccuracy, that their way was the proper one. Yet beneath all the pomp and piety, every class found the same simple comfort in that first sip. The warmth spreading through the chest, the quiet hum in the blood, the fleeting illusion that life wasn't so bad after all. Religion, of course, had opinions about everything, including beer, which it alternately blessed, condemned, ignored, and then secretly brewed in bulk. Monks, being practical men of God, recognized early that beer was far safer to drink than water, which had a nasty habit of containing surprises. So monasteries turned into brewing sanctuaries, complete with neat stone rooms, quiet courtyards, and rows of barrels stacked like well-behaved congregants. The monks brewed with a solemnity that suggested divine revelation, though most outsiders suspected the real revelation was that beer made fasting bearable. Pilgrims, those brave souls who walked for weeks to stare at a saint's pinky bone, relied heavily on monastery beer. It was cheap, plentiful, and usually better than anything brewed by roadside amateurs who thought sterilization was just a fancy word for worrying too much. A pilgrim could stumble into a monastery exhausted, blister-footed, and smelling like spiritual ambition, and receive a hearty mug of ale along with a bed of straw. The monk said it strengthened the body and calmed the mind. though curiously they never limited how many mugs a pilgrim could enjoy. One can imagine many a holy journey becoming only slightly holier than a tavern crawl. Speaking of taverns, the line between the sacred and the sinful was perilously thin, like the line between sobriety and singing to goats. Inns along pilgrimage routes catered to travellers' needs: food, drink, rumours, occasionally beds, and sometimes a deeply questionable bath. The ale flowed freely, too freely, if you ask the clergy. Pilgrims arrived intending to pray and left, remembering only that the inn's second brew tasted like enlightenment. More than one pious traveller spent the next morning asking Saint Whoever for forgiveness, mercy, and maybe a bucket. Tavern hospitality was a marvel of medieval contradictions. The innkeeper would welcome you warmly, offer a mug of house ale, and then charge you extra for everything, including the air. Beds were communal, if you were lucky. You might find yourself sharing quarters with a merchant, a miller, 3 chickens, and a man who claimed to have seen a dragon. If the inn was crowded, you slept upright at the table, propped between strangers who snored like disgruntled angels. Miraculously, the beer made it all seem fine. After a few mugs, even the fleas felt friendly. Inside these bustling establishments, sin and salvation lived together like awkward cousins at a family feast. A priest might be found in the corner delivering stern warnings between sips. A knight might repent of past sins and then immediately commit several new ones. And a merchant might brag about his wealth while hiding his coin purse under 3 layers of clothing. The tavern was a great equalizer. Everyone drank from similar mugs, sat on similar benches, and regretted similar decisions in the morning. Inns became tiny worlds where all classes collided. The nobleman and the peasant might argue about taxes, then laugh together over ale, then argue again about whose turn it was to buy the next round. Deals were struck over mugs, alliances formed, romances attempted, and sometimes chickens kidnapped. A travelling partner might stop in, offering indulgences to cleanse customers of sin, though he often drank enough to need several indulgences himself. The tavern saw every flavour of humanity, from the devout to the dangerous, which is perhaps why it felt so much like the church's mischievous twin. The church alternated between embracing taverns and despising them. Some holy men said beer was a gift from God, intended to keep his children hydrated and only mildly confused. Others thundered that alehouses were gateways to moral ruin. Yet even the most pious clergy acknowledged, quietly, awkwardly, that without beer, half their parishioners would be dead or worse, sober. And so sermons condemned drunkenness while conveniently overlooking who bought the monastery's latest batch. Pilgrimages themselves took on a beer-soaked flavour. Travellers traded tales of miraculous brews said to heal the sick, calm the anxious, or at least make them forget they'd been walking in the same pair of soggy shoes for 3 months. Some shrines became famous not for their relics, but for the taverns nearby. Pilgrims would arrive, pay their respects, and then enthusiastically pay their tab. A few enterprising innkeepers even claimed their beer was holy, blessed by saints, angels, or a monk who looked vaguely like someone famous. The thirsty believed what they wanted to believe. Some religious stories blurred into tavern mythology. One tale spoke of a saint who turned a river into beer so villagers could drink safely. Another warned of a demon who soured barrels in houses that failed to say grace before tapping. A third insisted that drinking 3 mugs on a feast day granted partial forgiveness, though who measured partial was unclear. Faith and fermentation were intertwined, muddled like herbs in a well-loved brew, and so religion and beer continued their awkward dance. Monasteries brewed, pilgrims drank, priests scolded, and somewhere a tavern cat judged everyone equally. Beer was both temptation and salvation, sometimes in the same evening, reminding medieval people that even the holiest lives needed warmth, fellowship, and a little liquid courage to keep going. Medieval law, the clumsy older sibling of common sense, had a lot to say about beer, usually while tripping over itself. Governments and local councils knew that beer was both a necessity and a menace, so they tried to regulate it with all the grace of a cow on ice. Laws were drafted, rewritten, ignored, rediscovered, and ignored again. Town officials passed ordinances forbidding the watering down of beer, which was noble in principle but difficult to enforce when half the officials were the ones doing it. To ensure honesty, they appointed ale tasters, public servants whose entire job was to drink beer and complain if it tasted suspiciously like sadness. These ale tasters would stroll from tavern to tavern, sampling the local offerings, taking notes, and sometimes falling asleep mid-inspection. Their reports, written in shaky handwriting, usually concluded with either acceptable or watered beyond hope, or occasionally tasted twice to be sure. The position was surprisingly prestigious. People respected anyone who could drink on the job and call it duty. Of course, ale tasters were notorious for accepting bribes in the form of more beer, which certainly complicated their objectivity. But no one complained too loudly. After all, corruption was just another flavour of medieval life. Because beer was safer than water, even crime found its way to the tavern. Arguments sparked over spilled ale, borrowed mugs, or poorly timed insults. The most common tavern offence wasn't murder or theft, but excessive enthusiasm, a polite way of saying someone got drunk, stood on a table and attempted interpretive dance. Punishment varied. A first offence might earn a stern warning, a second might get you tossed outside, a third might involve being tied to a post until you sobered up, or until someone remembered you were there. Very serious crimes, like cheating at dice, could result in public shaming, which often meant the culprit was forced to buy drinks for everyone until they forgave him or forgot why they were angry. Some cities passed curfews specifically for taverns. No ale shall be served after dark, the laws proclaimed. Taverns responded by installing shutters and serving ale through holes in the wall like medieval drive-thrus. Authorities tried to stop them. Tavern keepers tried to pretend they had no idea what last call meant. The resulting cat-and-mouse game resembled a children's play, except the children were drunk and the mice were too. Beer also fueled more serious crimes. Records tell of thefts where burglars broke into cellars not to steal coin, but to tap into barrels they couldn't afford. In one town, a man tunnelled into a monastery brewery, only to become hopelessly intoxicated and fall asleep beneath the casks, where he was found snoring and clutching a ladle like a holy relic. His punishment was unclear, though the record notes the monks were deeply annoyed, and which is probably the worst thing you can make a monk. In another tale, a group of bandits hijacked a shipment of beer bound for a noble estate. They celebrated their success by drinking the loot on the roadside, promptly forgot their horses, and wandered off into the woods singing. Authorities found them days later, hungry, embarrassed, and still slightly drunk. Their sentence? A fine and a stern reminder that crime requires planning, not just thirst. But some legal responses to beer-related chaos were more creative. In one region, habitual drunks were sentenced to wear a wooden barrel as public humiliation, essentially a medieval sandwich board, but rounder. The offender shuffled around town, arms and legs poking out awkwardly, while children chased them and adults pretended not to laugh. The sentence lasted until the offender promised to drink less, a promise everyone knew would be broken by sunset. There were also quaint laws meant to protect the purity of beer. For instance, some towns banned the use of certain herbs, believing they stirred sinful desires, not that the beer itself needed help. Others banned brewing on Sundays, arguing that God needed one day without yeast fumes. The people largely ignored this law, reasoning that God probably enjoyed a pint as much as anyone. And then there were the trials, strange legal spectacles where beer became the star witness. If someone fell ill, neighbours wondered, was it cursed beer, witchcraft, or just a bad batch? Sometimes the brewer would be hauled into court to defend their honour. The jury would taste the beer, which must have been deeply scientific. If they liked it, the brewer was acquitted. If they disliked it, the brewer might be fined or required to brew something better next time. In extreme cases, the beer itself was poured out as punishment, though onlookers often wept at the waste. Through all this, beer quietly remained the lifeblood of society. It fueled work and worship, sparked arguments and laughter, and offered comfort when the law felt less like justice, and more like a joke told by someone with no timing. Crime and punishment danced awkwardly around the alehouse, never managing to sober it up, and so the records filled with tales of drunken mishaps, misdemeanor chaos, and legal decisions that made sense only to people who lived their entire lives slightly buzzed. Family life in the medieval world was stitched together with thread, prayer, and, naturally, beer. It appeared at the hearth the way a mischievous uncle appears at every wedding, uninvited yet somehow essential. From the moment a child could grip a wooden cup without spilling the contents on the dog, they were introduced to small ale. Not enough to make them stagger, just enough to keep them hydrated and slightly more agreeable than usual. Medieval parents offered beer with the same resigned enthusiasm modern parents offered juice boxes. It kept the children quiet for 5 minutes, which qualified as a miracle. Childhood under the influence of small ale wasn't as chaotic as you might think. Sure, children occasionally tried to ride geese or argue with chickens, but honestly they did that sober too. Beer simply gave them the courage to attempt foolish things with a smile. Some families believed a splash of ale in an infant's mouth would help them sleep, because what better way to soothe a newborn than to introduce them early to society's only dependable beverage? Still, caution existed. Parents watered the ale down so much that it was more confused than alcoholic. As children grew, they learned that beer wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle. They watched their parents brew, stir, taste and mutter about yeast like it was an unruly cousin. Brewing became a family affair, with each member contributing. Father hauled grain, mother brewed, children fetched water and occasionally fell into barrels. The process bound the household together in shared labour and shared consumption, which may explain why medieval families were so accustomed to each other's nonsense. Teenagers, predictably, pushed the limits. They snuck sips of the stronger stuff, the beer meant for special occasions or Uncle Thomas's back pain. Alehouses became their unofficial classrooms, where they learned valuable lessons like never challenge a stranger to a drinking contest. If you do, never let your mother find out, and if she does, run. They drank, boasted, flirted disastrously, and occasionally got into trouble with the town watch. Their parents scolded them loudly while quietly remembering their own ale-fueled mistakes, like that time they tried to serenade a goat and ended up engaged to a shepherd. In adulthood, beer became as constant as the weather, unpredictable in quantity, reliably disappointing in taste, yet always present. Men drank to celebrate harvests, to mourn losses, or simply because it was Tuesday. Women drank because men existed, and because brewing all day was thirsty work. Couples drank together in the evenings, trading weary glances over mugs, knowing they were bound by vows, children, and mutual dehydration. In some villages, a marriage wasn't considered official until the couple shared a ceremonial mug, preferably without spilling it on the priest. Beer also played a role in courtship. A young man might offer his intended a cup of decent ale, a gesture that said, "I care for you," or possibly, "This is the only thing of value I own." If she accepted, he blushed. If she refused, he drank both cups because waste was a sin. Tavern flirtation was its own delicate art. Young lovers exchanged shy glances across tables, only to be interrupted by a neighbour's drunken story about a heroic chicken. Still, many romances blossomed under the influence of ale, proof that even slightly sour beer could lead to sweet endings. As people aged, their relationship with beer deepened, like a barrel left too long in the cellar. Elderly villagers drank for comfort, for warmth, and because they had learned long ago that water was not to be trusted. Grandparents told stories of the good old days, conveniently forgetting how terrible those days actually were. They swore the beer tasted better back then, just as they swore they remembered walking 10 miles to school uphill both ways, usually barefoot. Whether or not these claims were true didn't matter. Beer had earned its place beside their memories, blurred and softened like a favourite song hummed out of tune. Even workers on the brink of old age kept brewing, though more slowly. Their kettles simmered while they shared tales of youthful idiocy and miraculous survival. They advised younger brewers, poorly but enthusiastically, and insisted that the secret to good beer was either patience, prayer, or a clean cat. No one could agree. When they could no longer work the mash or haul grain, they were still welcome in the alehouse, where community and companionship flowed as freely as the taps. Funerals brought beer full circle. Mourners gathered in homes or taverns after burial, lifting mugs to honour the departed. It was said that a good funeral ended with an empty barrel. Otherwise, the deceased would feel unappreciated. People shared stories of the deceased, true ones at first, then increasingly embellished as the ale worked its magic. If the dead could hear what was said about them, many would have come back just to protest. Through childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age, beer was like that persistent relative who attended every milestone, whether invited or not. It witnessed triumphs, softened tragedies, and made everyday life tolerable. It was a taste of comfort, a tool of survival, and sometimes the reason Uncle Geoffrey disappeared for 3 days. As the medieval world crept toward the early modern era, beer didn't fade, it flourished. Cities grew, trade expanded, and brewing techniques evolved. people began to question old superstitions, though most kept them just in case. Water was still suspicious. Beer remained beloved. Its place in society only strengthened, weaving itself deeper into culture, economy, and identity. Beer, having conquered the household, the church, and the occasional wedding guest, turned its foamy gaze toward commerce, because nothing says economic opportunity like a beverage safer than the water. As towns grew and people realized that living near each other meant sharing more than just fleas, merchants began seeking profit in anything that didn't spoil within a week. Enter hopped beer, now sturdy enough to survive long journeys without turning into regret. Brewers quickly learned that good beer could travel farther than gossip, which, in medieval terms, was impressive. Soon, merchants were packing their carts and ships with barrels, rolling them down to coastal ports like proud parents escorting overachieving children to college. Ships groaned under the weight of ale as they crossed the channel, navigating storms, pirates, and the occasional confused fish. Sailors drank beer at sea because water stored in barrels grew slimy faster than you could say, "We should have stayed home." Beer, meanwhile, held strong, less noble than wine, but far less likely to betray them by sprouting fury-coloured mould. Some voyages measured time not by distance, but by how many barrels were left before mutiny became likely. Trade networks blossomed around beer like drunken ivy. Brewers in the Low Countries developed reputations that stretched across Europe. Towns such as Hamburg and Bremen became bustling beer hubs, where ships docked daily to unload grain and reload liquid encouragement. These places thrived, their economies buoyed by the fact that when something keeps people alive, they tend to want more of it, whether or not it tastes like bitter bread seasoned with hope. Investors, smelling opportunity, and yeast, poured money into breweries. In an era when banking was risky and most professions involved sweating near animals, investing in beer seemed downright sophisticated. Of course, success bred envy like a bored cat breeds kittens. Rival towns accused each other of stealing yeast strains, watering down exports, or smuggling illegal hops. Brewers swore oaths on family honour and occasionally on their favourite drinking mugs to defend the integrity of their product. Laws were written to safeguard quality and fatten tax coffers. Some cities even developed official beer seals, stamped onto barrels to prove authenticity. These seals often depicted barley, hops, or saints who, when alive, had absolutely nothing to do with beer, but were suddenly recruited for marketing. As trade expanded, beer became unexpectedly scientific. Curious minds, some scholarly, others simply intoxicated with ambition, began studying the brewing process. They observed that yeast, though invisible, behaved like a tiny army, eating sugar, making alcohol, and occasionally causing chaos if mistreated. They noticed temperature mattered. Too cold and the brew sulked. Too hot and it died dramatically. Early brewers who paid attention to these details developed better beer. Those who didn't blamed elves. More than one unofficial brewing manual advised treating yeast with kindness, as if it were a sensitive houseguest who might pack up and leave if scolded. Alchemists, ever hopeful they might turn beer into gold, or at least a hangover cure, poked their noses into breweries, taking notes and muttering. They tried distilling, straining, fermenting twice, fermenting thrice, and occasionally setting things on fire, though it's unclear whether that was intentional or just the occupational hazard of working near medieval heating systems. Their experiments didn't yield gold, but they did uncover new ways of making stronger and more stable brews, which promptly fueled more experiments, more fire, and more theories scribbled in panicked handwriting. Even philosophers dipped their quills into the discussion. Some mused that beer allowed humans to glimpse divine truths. Others suspected it just made them more talkative. One scholar wrote that beer improves the spirit, loosens the tongue, and convinces a man he is wiser than he was. A timeless observation. With beer encouraging conversation, debate flourished. Taverns became as much intellectual hubs as monasteries, though with more shouting. Ideas spread from table to table like spilled foam, discussions about trade, God, governance, and where the cow had wandered off to this time. Urbanization brought larger, more sophisticated breweries. Stone mash houses with towering kettles became landmarks, belching fragrant steam that convinced townsfolk everything was going well, even when it wasn't. Breweries employed workers from maltsters to coopers, to apprentices whose main job was to stay out of the way and only occasionally fall into vats. Quality control improved, or at least became more creative. Some brewers tasted every batch themselves, a noble practice that left them pleasantly useless by afternoon. Others hired tasters whose palates were legendary and whose livers were tireless. Beer began shaping identity. Towns bragged about their local brews with the same pride reserved for saints, military victories, or especially fat livestock. Festivals centered around beer became annual traditions, drawing crowds in search of merriment and mild regret. Songs celebrated beloved brewers, poems compared foam to clouds and hops to tears of angels. It was all very dramatic for a beverage that occasionally smelled faintly of damp barn. The beer trade also encouraged cultural mingling. Merchants returned home with stories, recipes, and sometimes yeast that behaved like it had travelled too far and seen too much. Foreigners brought brewing techniques, spices, and new drinking games, most of which ended in dizziness and poor judgment. In alehouses, travellers swapped news, exaggerations, and alarming accounts of water that looked clean but wasn't. The world shrank slightly, held together by barrels and the shared understanding that beer was life, love, and the reason your uncle fell into a canal. Slowly, beer paved the way to the scientific revolution. Not intentionally, of course. No brewer set out to change the world. They just wanted a drink that didn't murder them. But necessity breeds curiosity, and curiosity, especially when encouraged by alcohol, breeds experimentation. Over time, brewing became less witchcraft and more craft. Measurements became precise. Temperature was taken seriously. Yeast was respected like a tiny invisible priest of fermentation. By the dawn of the early modern era, beer was no longer just a survival strategy. It was a cultural pillar, an economic force, and an accidental fuel for scientific progress. What began as a way to avoid filthy water ended up shaping commerce, study, and society itself. All because someone somewhere looked at a questionable river and thought, we can do better. The early modern tavern was what happened when the medieval alehouse survived puberty, got a fresh coat of paint, and decided to call itself respectable, though only on weekdays. These new establishments were larger, louder, and only slightly less dangerous than your average battlefield. They appeared on bustling streets and quiet crossroads alike, each promising warmth, conversation, and, most importantly, a beverage that wouldn't make your organs file a complaint. Signs hung outside depicting animals, crowns, tools, or occasionally something so abstract that everyone agreed to call it the Drunken Swan, even if it looked more like a terrified potato. Inside, the tavern transformed daily life into something tolerable. The floor was usually wooden, the tables scarred by knives and stories, and the ceiling beams darkened by a lifetime of smoke. The air carried a perfume of beer, sweat, gossip, and whatever the innkeeper had killed that morning for supper. A single candle sputtered bravely on each table, illuminating the faces of patrons who had seen too much, drunk too much, or both. Behind the counter, barrels stretched in a proud row like soldiers standing by for inevitable disaster. The clientele of a tavern was a lively mix. Tradesmen, merchants, apprentices, sailors, musicians, travelling scholars, and the occasional horse that wandered in because someone forgot to close the door. People gathered to trade news, argue politics, and speculate about why their neighbour's cow looked suspiciously smug. Philosophers debated life's great questions over their mugs, which usually ended in someone shouting, "No, you listen," before spilling half their drink onto their lap. The tavern wasn't picky about patrons. Anyone with a coin, a story, or the ability to nod convincingly at someone else's story was welcome. Serving beer became an art form. Some taverns prided themselves on offering a dizzying array of brews, dark and smoky, light and bright, or spiced just enough to make you question your taste in beverages and life choices. Others embraced a simpler approach, serving one kind of beer and reminding patrons they were lucky to have it. The best taverns had a house brew, something memorable in flavour and regrettable in effect. Locals drank it with pride, travellers drank it with caution, and everyone blamed it for whatever decisions followed. Public houses, pubs, to the cheerful and the forgetful, grew into neighbourhood centres. They were where people celebrated victories, mourned losses, negotiated business, and occasionally threw cheese at each other to resolve disputes. These pubs were often family-run, with generations of stubborn innkeepers insisting they had the best beer in the county. usually backed by a chorus of regulars too loyal to disagree. Pub loyalty became a religion of its own. Patrons defended their chosen public house with the same fervour. People elsewhere defended kings or questionable fashion trends. Regulars developed rituals. Some insisted on sitting at the same table every night, glaring at newcomers who dared to occupy their seat. Others demanded the first mug poured from a fresh barrel, believing it contained extra luck or extra yeast. A few eccentric souls claimed they could predict the future by examining the foam patterns on their beer. Their predictions were vague but comforting. A journey lies ahead. Beware the goose, or drink more, your destiny depends on it. With increased traffic came increased storytelling. Tales grew taller than the barrels that fueled them. A fisherman might claim he'd caught a sea serpent after 3 pints, only to downgrade it to a particularly judgmental eel once sober. Sailors boasted of storms so fierce that their mugs never spilled a drop, though witnesses suspected their mugs were already empty. Minstrels sang songs that began sensibly and ended with dragons, lost loves, and sandwiches that betrayed them. Beer didn't just oil the conversation, it inflated it like a proud, drunken balloon. Not all evenings ran smoothly. With drink came drama. Fights broke out over trivial matters: who sat where, whose beard was superior, or whether a saint would prefer dark ale or pale. Tavern keepers became adept referees, breaking up scuffles with firm words, broom handles, or in extreme cases, by simply removing all the beer and watching everyone sober up in terrified silence. Once the fighting ceased, grudges dissolved as quickly as the beer returned. Many a lifelong friendship began with a fistfight followed by a heartfelt apology over shared drinks. But for all its chaos, the tavern was a place of refuge. Travellers found safety from lonely roads and suspicious forests. Labourers found relief after punishing days. Widows found companionship, and widowers found someone who pretended to understand them. The tavern dog accepted everyone, especially those with meat pies. In a world where daily life was uncertain and often cruel, the tavern was a sanctuary of warmth, belonging, and fermented optimism. Some taverns doubled as inns, offering rooms upstairs for those too tired or too drunk to journey onward. The beds were lumpy, the sheets questionable, and the noise continuous, but they were still better than sleeping outside with wolves, bandits, or the occasional goose with a grudge. Travelling families squeezed into single rooms, their snoring forming a harmonious chorus with everyone else downstairs. The unlucky slept in the stable, waking to the smell of hay and the disapproving gaze of horses. Meanwhile, beer's popularity only deepened. Taverns became hallowed ground for communities. The first place news spread, the first place strangers became friends, and the first place foolish plans were made. Revolutions may have started in palaces, but they were rehearsed in pubs, hammered out between slurred speeches and ale-fueled boasts. A good tavern was more than a business. It was a stage where life's tragedies and comedies played out nightly, sometimes simultaneously. As the early modern era approached, beer's influence seeped into every corner of society. It shaped laws, livelihoods, and legends. It fueled trade, fostered science, and encouraged a particularly enthusiastic kind of optimism. It stood at the crossroads of culture and chaos, offering comfort in a cup and hope in a barrel. When beer hitched a ride across the seas into the colonial world, it did so with all the swagger of a seasoned sailor who'd forgotten most of his baggage, but somehow remembered every drinking song. European settlers brought their brewing habits with them, partly out of tradition and partly because they took one look at the New World's rivers, thought of home, and wisely said, "Absolutely not, we're boiling that first." The water was often questionable, or at least suspiciously enthusiastic about making people sick, so beer remained the trusted companion it had always been. Comforting, familiar, and only occasionally responsible for poor judgment. In the early colonies, brewing was both practical and patriotic. Settlers arrived with dreams of prosperity and pockets full of yeast. They set to work building homes, planting fields, and, within approximately 15 minutes, brewing beer. Life demanded priorities. Grain wasn't always abundant, so colonists used whatever they had on hand. Barley if they were lucky, corn if they were adaptable, pumpkins if they were desperate, and random plants if they'd given up on dignity. These improvised brews tasted odd, but they got the job done. Pumpkin beer, for instance, was either a bold experiment or a regretful cry for help, depending on one's tolerance. Brewing once again became household labour, especially among women. Just like in the medieval world, colonial alewives brewed for families, inns and communities. Even Puritans, those bastions of restraint who frowned at anything remotely joyful, kept beer at the table. They wrote stern poetry about the fleeting nature of life, then paired it with a foamy brew. Children drank small beer daily, because nothing says childhood innocence like a beverage brewed in a kettle, previously used to scald chickens. Colonial leaders took beer seriously, sometimes more seriously than governing. George Washington, not only a general and president, but apparently also a man with opinions about malt, kept his own beer recipes. He brewed at Mount Vernon, though it's unclear whether he actually stirred the mash himself, or just inspected it with the same stoic expression he wore while crossing rivers. Benjamin Franklin famously remarked that beer was evidence God loved humanity and wanted them to be happy, an idea he likely came up with after discovering water could not in fact be trusted. Beer influenced early colonial trade routes too. Bars and taverns sprouted across settlements like weeds, helpful, social weeds with questionable flaws. These taverns weren't just drinking holes, they were political theatres. Revolutionaries gathered over mugs to complain about British taxes, draft grand plans, and occasionally knock over furniture in moments of patriotic zeal. Some historians suggest that the American Revolution began because colonists were tired of unfair taxation. Others argue it was because they'd had just enough beer to think rebellion was a great idea. The truth is probably both. Meanwhile, global taste began to shift. Trade expanded, and ships carried yeast, hops, and brewing knowledge across oceans like contraband happiness. India, for example, became a destination for British beer, not because locals demanded it, but because British soldiers wanted something familiar after realising tropical heat could kill them faster than home. Thus came the birth of India Pale Ale (IPA), a beer fortified with extra hops to survive the journey. The result tasted bright, bitter, and faintly resentful, like a beverage unhappy about the miles it had travelled. Still, it survived, and soldiers drank it eagerly, proof that distance makes the heart grow thirstier. As brewing spread, new cultures left their mark. Some regions embraced beer, adapting styles to their climate and crops. Others, already devoted to other fermented friends like wine, rice brews, or palm liquor, treated beer like a well-meaning but slightly confused visitor. But wherever it landed, beer found a way into daily life, whether as a refreshing companion to labour or a troublesome instigator of song. Enter science, stage left, still slightly hungover from the alchemist's wild experiments. As knowledge advanced, brewing shifted further from mystery into method. Microscopes revealed yeast as living creatures, gloriously tiny, inexplicably powerful, and probably annoyed by how often they'd been blamed on fairies. Brewers learned to control temperature and fermentation with precision, rather than frantic guesswork and prayer. Barrels gave way to bottles, kitchens evolved into breweries, and just add herbs and hope transformed into something almost respectable. In this era, breweries grew like castles, tall, impressive, and occasionally filled with yelling. Workers perfected malting techniques, kilning grains to create pale ales, dark stouts, and everything in between. Newly urban populations flocked to drinking halls where beer was poured by the gallon, and if it tasted slightly metallic, no one asked questions. Cities relied on beer for nutrition, hydration, and entertainment. Also for regulating the crowds, because nothing distracted revolutionaries like a fresh cask. As centuries turned, beer became inseparable from identity. Regions crafted signature styles, crisp lagers from Central Europe, smoky ales from Germany, creamy porters from London's roughest wharves. Each beer carried traces of the people who brewed it, accents in grain and yeast, stories locked within barrels. Breweries formed dynasties. Some became household names, others vanished when owners drank the profits. But the shared idea persisted. Beer was a companion, a story, a necessity, and sometimes all three. Still, despite all the progress, beer never lost its medieval soul. It remained stubborn, communal, and endlessly curious. It survived wars, famines, plagues, revolutions, and questionable fashion trends. It fueled peasants and presidents alike, nurtured poets and pirates, and offered comfort when the world felt enormous, confusing, or just slightly sticky. And even as global empires rose and fell, beer never stopped doing what it did best, helping humanity look at its problems, shrug slightly, and say, "We'll try again tomorrow,"